Hey guys, I am here to help you today. This video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Now get comfortable and relax. I felt the unsettling presence before I even turned the key in the lock. The corridor leading to my new apartment was damp and dim, with only a single overhead bulb flickering erratically, as if struggling against the darkness. Something about the air itself waited, pressing in on my chest. Even as I reached for the doorknob, a small instinctive voice within me warned that I should stop, that I should turn around and flee back the way I came. Yet, I suppressed that urge, convincing myself it was only the unfamiliar space in my nerves, and stepped inside. From the moment I moved in, I realized the place was smaller than I had initially remembered. My single bedroom was cramped, leaving just enough space for a full-sized bed and a narrow walkway. A lone window let in the faint glow of streetlights, though the glass was cloudy, and the outside view offered nothing but the vague silhouette of neighboring buildings. The walls seemed old with hairline cracks, spider webbing across the paint. The air smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and something acidic I couldn't quite identify. While every new dwelling has its own quirks, this apartment radiated a clammy, oppressive energy that wrapped around me like an ill-fitting coat. The strangest aspect of this room, a east wall by the window that connected to a small external service area on the other side. On my first night, I brushed it off as city noise, but there was a peculiar vibration that came from that corner. It was faint at first, like a muffled hum, but it climbed into my consciousness. Whenever I lay still, my pulse would quicken and I'd have trouble keeping my breath steady, as though my body sensed something lurking just beneath the wallpaper. Initially, I told myself it might be an old pipe or a loose vent, but if I concentrated too hard on that sound, I'd get the strangest mental image of a slow rhythmic pulse, something with a heartbeat of its own. Early on, I left my bed in its normal position near the center of the room, far from that corner, but within a few days, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't stand not knowing. I decided to shift the bed toward that wall, thinking I might identify the source of the sound more easily if I slept right next to it. So, one evening, after pushing and shoving furniture around, I placed the mattress so that the headboard was nestled directly in that corner. I wasn't particularly superstitious, but an undercurrent of dread washed over me as I settled in for the night. My hands trembled a little, and I had to swallow repeatedly just to ease the dryness in my mouth. My heart felt uncomfortably rapid, like I just sprinted up several flights of stairs. It didn't take long for the strangeness to intensify. The first few nights, I found myself jolting awake around 3 o'clock in the morning, my skin slick with cold sweat. My heart would be thumping so loudly that my ears rang with each heavy beat, and I'd have this irrational sense that something was looming near the foot of the bed. With my eyes adjusted to the dark, I'd sweep my gaze across the tiny room. Nothing was visible, however. Every instinct in my body screamed that I wasn't alone. The corner by the window felt charged, like static electricity before a lightning strike. A prickling sensation crept up my arms and I'd break out in goosebumps. Even though the thermostat said it was a perfectly mild night, I couldn't explain why, but it felt like there were eyes on me. During the day, things were relatively normal. The odd hum persisted in the wall, but I could distract myself with tasks, organizing my sparse belongings, cleaning the small kitchen, and heading to my new job. Yet, I couldn't entirely shake the anticipation of nightfall. I found myself dreading the moment I'd have to turn off the lamp and slip under the covers. Each time I did, I felt as if I were offering myself up to something I didn't understand. My anxiety started to show physically. My fingers would tremble when I tried to hold my mug in the mornings, and I noticed dark circles forming under my eyes in the bathroom mirror. I also started flinching at everyday noises, like the whir of the refrigerator, or the distant honking of cars outside. One afternoon, I asked the building manager in a roundabout way if previous tenants had complained about odd vibrations or noises in that unit. He shrugged, said in a clipped tone that nobody had mentioned anything, but admitted the building was old. Then he walked away as though the subject made him uncomfortable. I wondered if he knew more than he let on, but decided not to push. I told myself that perhaps I was imagining things, or maybe it was just the plumbing in the wall. Still, I couldn't erase the unsettling nighttime episodes from my mind. As the weeks passed, the bizarre experiences escalated. Waking with a start became a nightly ritual. But the worst part was the sense of being watched. It was visceral, like a pair of invisible hands pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Some nights I felt an indescribable heaviness in my limbs, as though it required colossal effort just to move my arms. My skin would be slick with sweat, my pajamas clinging uncomfortably. A few times I struggled to swallow, and panic surged in my chest when I realized my throat had gone so dry that it felt nearly swollen shut. On a particularly harrowing night, I swore I saw movement in that corner by the window. It was a fleeting, shadowy flicker that disappeared. The moment I tried to focus on it, the logical part of my brain wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the dim light, perhaps a reflection from the street. But deep down, I felt convinced it was something else entirely. My paranoia flourished. I found myself keeping the bedside lamp on, hoping the brightness would dispel any illusions. That week, flickering light only seemed to deepen the shadows, though, creating new shapes on the walls and ceiling. My imagination ran wild as I stared into the changing shadows, half expecting them to reach out for me. Soon, the fear infiltrated my waking life in more subtle ways. While trying to cook dinner, I might sense movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find the kitchen empty. Or I'd be taking a shower and feel a sudden drop in temperature, as though an unseen figure had just stepped into the bathroom. My heart would race, and a hot flush of dread would creep over my cheeks. The rational part of me recognized these signs of mounting anxiety, but acknowledging that it was just stress didn't dissipate the claustrophobic panic. Eventually, I rearranged my bed back to its original position, closer to the center of the room. The difference was immediate. The strange vibrations quieted down to a more tolerable level, and I slept more deeply, without the persistent sense that I was being observed. For about a week, I felt almost normal again, though the memory of those harrowing nights refused to fade. The wall near the window still bothered me. When I walked by that corner, my scalp would tingle as if it recognized a threat, but I could function in a way that felt less terrifying. So, I tried to stick to this new arrangement. Then, curiosity sank its hooks in me once more. I started thinking, had I let my imagination run wild? Was this all an irrational response to the stress of moving? I needed to test it again. Needed to see if sleeping in that corner truly triggered such nightmarish sensations, or if it had been some elaborate trick of my own mind. So, I did the unthinkable. I pushed the bed back. It was a reckless choice driven by a compulsion to prove whether the fear was genuine or purely psychological. The very act of sliding the mattress across the floor made my heart hammer, and I remember laughing nervously to myself, as if to dispel the tension. The first night in the corner again was worse than anything before. I woke up drenched in sweat with the most profound certainty that someone stood right beside me, leaning over the bed. My eyes shut open, and a choking gasp escaped my throat. The room was dark, and the street lamp outside cast just enough light for me to see that there was nobody physically there. Yet the entire right side of my body tingled, as if I was sharing the bed with a presence. My breathing grew ragged, and I felt pinned by terror. When I finally managed to switch on the lamp, my hands were shaking so badly I almost knocked it off its stand. In the sudden brightness, I saw nothing unusual. No footprints, no shape, no sign of forced entry. but I could swear the air in that corner was cold enough to make my breath hitch. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Instead, I sat upright with my back against the headboard, every nerve on alert. My muscles ached from the tension, and my jaw felt stiff from clenching. My teeth, whenever exhaustion threatened to drag me under, I'd twitch awake, convinced I'd heard a whisper or felt a hand brushing my arm. These experiences weren't just visual or auditory, they were tactile. I sensed pressure, shifts in the air current, and an unmistakable sense of proximity. It was as if something was intimately aware of my presence and derived pleasure from making itself known. By the next morning, I was delirious from lack of rest. My shirt stuck to my back, and the apartment's stale odor seemed more pungent than ever. There was an almost metallic taste in my mouth that wouldn't go away, and every sip of water felt thick and unsatisfying. My nerves were raw, and I could barely muster the energy to complete simple tasks. Later that day, I tried to brush off the experiences, convince myself once more that it was my mind's response to an unexplainable noise in the wall. I debated calling an electrician or a plumber, but part of me dreaded someone else discovering something I wasn't prepared to face. That evening, as darkness enveloped the apartment, I took a seat on the edge of the bed, facing window. I listened intently to the vibration in the wall, a low, constant thrumming that resonated like a heartbeat. I felt strangely drawn to it, as if acknowledging its existence made it stronger. My own pulse began to sync with the rhythm, and soon I couldn't distinguish which beats were mine and which belonged to the noise in the wall. My breathing became ragged, and beads of sweat formed on my forehead. I had the strangest impression that if I reached out and touched that wall, it might respond like living flesh. That night, I experienced what I can only describe as a waking nightmare. I was half asleep, delirious from tension, when my vision blurred, and I could barely keep my eyes open. That's when I felt a shift in the mattress, a weight pressing down on the space beside me. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath coming in rapid, shallow gulps. Unable to move, I was paralyzed by sheer unfiltered terror. The unseen presence pressed closer, radiating cold that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it leaning toward me as if it wanted to make contact. A sickening wave of dread coursed through my veins, and my muscles trembled under the strain of trying to flee. I wanted to leap up, scream, do anything to break that horrifying moment, but I was frozen. Eventually, the feeling subsided, and I snapped into full consciousness, lurching upright and almost tumbling out of bed. The adrenaline aftermath left me shaking uncontrollably, my limbs tingling with pins and needles. The lamp was still on, revealing nothing but an empty corner. Yet, the sheets next to me felt unnaturally cold. My teeth chattered even though sweat dripped down the sides of my face. A wave of nausea twisted my stomach, and I stumbled to the bathroom, retching. That was the moment I realized I needed to reclaim some measure of control, or this apartment would consume me entirely. Without a second thought, I dragged the bed back to the center of the room. Every time the frame scraped against the floor, it flinched as if I expected something to lash out from that corner and drag me into the wall. By the time I'd finished, my arms felt weak, and my heart still pounded furiously, but I sensed a slight relief, a small victory over whatever had been lurking in that spot. The moment the bed was distanced from the window wall, the air felt less suffocating, as though a dark cloud had lifted. I spent the following night sleeping fitfully, but without the nightmarish intensity I had experienced in that cursed corner. Time passed, and I tried my best to forget. I told myself it had been a vivid series of nightmares, fueled by stress and the unrelenting hum in the wall. The logical part of me clung to that explanation, yet a deeper part suspected something else entirely. Even in the weeks that followed, when I moved furniture around to make the space more habitable, when I hung pictures on the walls, and when I convinced myself I was settling in, I could never completely ignore that corner. It always seemed darker, as if the shadows bunched up against the baseboards in that spot. On rare occasions, late at night, when I was particularly exhausted, I still sensed that faint hum, reminding me that I wasn't the only occupant in that room. I eventually learned to live with it by carefully avoiding that area. I placed a small table in the corner, stacking it with books and a lamp, refusing to leave any space large enough for whatever force might try to linger again. The nights became less tumultuous, yet a piece of the dread remained lodged in my consciousness. Sometimes, as I drifted off to sleep, I felt the unmistakable tickle of paranoia, urging me to keep one eye open. My heart would give a startled flutter whenever I remembered the sensation of cold pressure on the mattress. To this day, I still have no concrete explanation for that persistent vibration or the oppressive presence that haunted that corner. I considered having a professional check the wiring or the plumbing, but I never did. Part of me feared they might discover something far more sinister than faulty pipes. Instead, I quietly accepted that I would never truly know the source. Occasionally, I wonder if the previous tenant experienced anything similar, if they too had felt that weight on the bed or caught a glimpse of a shape moving in the darkness. I'll never have those answers. What I do know is that the atmosphere changed the moment I abandoned that corner. The vibrations lessened and the icy tension lifted enough for me to carry on with my life. Yet, I remained wary even all these months. Later, sometimes when I walk past that spot at night, a sudden chill ripples through me. My pulse quickens and my skin bristles with goosebumps. There's no logical reason for such a reaction, and I always try to shake it off, but in the back of my mind, I sense it's still there, whatever it was, pulsing in the wall, waiting. I keep my bed away from that corner, and I never linger by the window if I can help it. I learned my lesson. Some questions are best left tombsward. Some mysteries left unsolved. Perhaps the apartment was only echoing my own fears, or perhaps something else was claiming a small piece of reality, content to whisper in the darkness. Either way, I know better now. And every time night falls and the shadows deepen, I remind myself there are corners of this world that we shouldn't disturb. And there, in that cramped bedroom, exists a boundary I refuse to cross again. I remember the moment I first set foot in that house. The air felt heavier than a mel, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to do something, anything, to disturb their silence. A faint odor of damp wood and stale paint clung to the corridors, and the echo of my own footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. From the very beginning, I felt as though the structure were watching me with quiet, unsettling awareness. I was there to help my friend Marcus renovate the place he had recently inherited. It was a large old house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place that normally would have seemed charming. But there was something off about it that made my skin tighten. Even outside, standing on the driveway, I sensed I was being observed. I tried convincing myself it was nerves or just my imagination, but my heart rate was already accelerating before it stepped inside. Marcus had started sanding down some of the aging walls in the living room. My task was to organize the garage, an unassuming rectangular space with a low ceiling and dim lighting. The single overhead bulb flickered occasionally, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The moment I crossed the threshold from the kitchen into that garage, I felt the temperature drop. My breath got caught in my throat and my skin prickled, as though a frigid hand had pressed against the back of my neck. I paused, my entire body tensing in a mix of confusion and unease. The garage itself was cluttered with old boxes, furniture, and tools, most of it covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Dark corners seemed to swallow the light, creating pockets of shadow that made it difficult to see the full extent of the room. My instructions were simple: clear a path, gather anything salvageable and set it aside. Still, I hesitated, realizing my palms had started to sweat even though the air felt cold. The first few minutes passed uneventfully. I moved some worn-out tarps off a rickety chair, stacked them near the door, and tried to ignore the persistent feeling that someone was standing just behind me. Every time it ended, I found only emptiness. My heart pounded a little faster each time this happened. The overhead bulb buzzed softly, then flickered again, momentarily plunging the garage into semi-darkness. My breath hitched, and I fumbled for my flashlight, which I had left perched on a nearby box. When the light returned, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A tall, narrow cabinet jammed into the farthest corner of the garage, secured with a rusty padlock. The sight of that cabinet unsettled me. It looked older than of everything else in the garage. Its wood swollen with age and dampness. An unfamiliar sense of dread crept into my chest, making my heartbeat resonate in my ears. I could practically feel the pounding in my temples. I wiped a layer of dust off the cabinet's face. The padlock, once black, was now mottled with corrosion. Its surface rough to the touch. Oddly enough, it wasn't fully latched. One little tug, and it popped open, landing in my hand with a clang that echoed in the confined space. At first, I expected to discover something bizarre or disturbing inside. The entire aura of that cabinet suggested a hidden secret, maybe old letters or photographs, possibly some relic from the previous owner's life. Instead, I found only a set of dirty, tattered rags thrown at the bottom. An instant wave of disappointment, mixed with relief, washed over me. I let out a shaky exhale and stepped back, feeling a little foolish for the anxiety that had built up in my chest. Yet, at the very moment I turned away, a prickling sensation crawled up my spine. My eyes landed on the small window in the garage, cracked and covered with grime, but still reflective enough to catch movement. In that hazy reflection, I glimpsed a figure. It stood tall, motionless behind me, like a dark silhouette that had no place in the reality I recognized. My lungs seemed to freeze. My hands turned clammy. Adrenaline coursed through my body in a heartbeat. When I spun around with a surge of panic, the space behind me was empty. Silence pressed in frontal sides, so profound it made the electrical hum of the bulb sound deafening. My knees felt weak, and cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck. My breathing came in shallow bursts that left my throat dry. I wanted to convince myself I had simply seen my own reflection distorted by the filthy window. Or maybe just a trick of the dim light, but my senses insisted otherwise. I could still feel the lingering presence, as if someone had been standing there breathing into the same stale air I was breathing. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance. Without a second thought, I grabbed my flashlight, left the garage, and slammed the door behind me. When I reported to Marcus what had happened, he didn't look surprised. He told me, though more in a half-whisper than a casual statement, that he had always sensed something watching him whenever he had to enter the garage. He mentioned that he avoided doing any major work in there, preferring to keep the door shut. I felt the blood drain from my face, realizing his admission validated my inexperience. My heart was still pounding. We continued the renovation work for a while, though every passing hour made me more reluctant to return to the garage. The mere thought of standing in that darkness next to that cabinet made my pulse quicken uncomfortably. Marcus eventually called a locksmith, wanting to remove any old locks or cabinets altogether, hoping to strip the garage of whatever atmosphere it seemed to harbor. Even the locksmith appeared uneasy. He barely spoke, finishing his job in record time before hurrying back to his truck. He had the practiced calm of someone who has seen strange things in many old houses, yet chooses not to ask questions. When he left, his footsteps sounded hurried, as if he wanted to escape something that lurked behind those peeling walls. Over the next 2 days, I tried to focus on the renovation tasks in the main part of the house. I patched holes in the hallway, replaced some broken tiles in the kitchen, and helped Marcus prime the living room walls. Yet, my mind kept returning to that cabinet and to the reflection in the dirty window. Every so often, I'd hear odd noises in the house, low creaks in the floorboards, distant tapping in the pipes, an occasional rustling as though something was being dragged across the attic floor above. These sounds seemed to intensify my anxiety, even though I knew old homes often groan and settle in ways that can spook the unaccustomed. The nights were worse. We decided to sleep in the house to tackle the work more efficiently. My first night there, I lay awake 4 hours, listening to the wind gust against the windows, rattling them in their frames. Around midnight, I could have sworn I heard faint scratching behind the walls. It was so subtle, I almost doubted my own ears, yet it persisted long enough for me to feel my chest tighten in apprehension. My breathing became shallow, and I turned on my side, trying to block out every possible noise. Sleep was elusive, and my body remained tense, as if prepared to spring out of bed at the slightest provocation. On the second night, I dreamt of that garage window. In my dream, I was standing in front of it, peering into the glass, but instead of my reflection, the silhouette from before stared back at me. It had no distinct features, just an outline of a person, blacker than any shadow I had ever seen, with elongated limbs and a slight tilt of its head. In the dream, I couldn't move or speak, trapped in silent terror as it gradually leaned closer, almost pressing against the glass. When I woke, my shirt was drenched in sweat, and my heart pounded so hard I feared it might burst from my chest. My throat was dry, and I found myself gasping for air in the darkness. The house was silent, yet I sensed an uncanny presence just outside my bedroom door. Even though I told myself I was being irrational, I couldn't shake that bone-deep conviction that something was out there. The next morning, I went outside to clear my head. A damp fog had settled over the yard, making the air thick and chilly. My skin prickled as I looked up at the house. The windows stared back like empty eyes, and the paint on the siding seemed to peel a bit more every time I blinked. I tried to convince myself that I was letting my imagination run wild, but it's difficult to dismiss a dread that settles into your bones. A gnawing intuition that warns you of something intangible yet undeniably real. Marcus insisted we finish what we started in the garage. He suggested we remove old shelves, discard anything that looked rotten, and gather all remaining debris for a final dump run. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced myself to accompany him. As soon as we opened the door, the cold breath of that place seemed to envelop me. I hadn't noticed it the first time, but the garage ceiling was stained with dark splotches, possibly water damage. The overhead bulb flickered in protest, as though upset we had returned. We worked in an easy silence. Marcus handed me tools, and I pried old nails from the studs, my stomach churning with every reverberation of metal against wood. The dull clang chode, creating a rhythm that felt oddly menacing in its repetition. My breath quickened each time a shadow shifted in my peripheral vision. I tried to keep my focus on the tasks at hand, but my nerves were frayed, and my palms turned slick with sweat. At one point, I bent down to pick up a loose hammer on the floor. When I stood up, my eyes inadvertently flicked to that grimy window. My pulse jumped instantly. I saw the silhouette again just beyond my shoulder. My heart pounded so hard that a rush of blood filled my ears with its thumping. Tears of panic welled in my eyes, and I nearly dropped the hammer. Despite my fear, I spun around as quickly as I could, determined to confront whatever I thought was standing there. Nothing, only Marcus, several feet away, rummaging through a box of rusted tools. He looked up questioningly, noticing my pallor. I tried to calm down, inhaling shaky breaths, my whole body trembling. I thought I felt a current of cold air pass right behind me, grazing the nape of my neck. The sensation made me jerk forward, skin crawling as though touched by invisible fingers. I couldn't endure the garage any longer. My rational mind was collapsing under the weight of unexplained sights and sensations. I told Marcus I needed to step out for a moment, not caring if I sounded weak or irrational. I emerged into the daylight, letting the sun warm my face and banish the chill that seemed lodged under my skin. My limbs were trembling, my breath ragged. I paced around the driveway, trying to shake the dread that had settled into my gut. Even outside, I felt exposed and vulnerable, as if the malevolent atmosphere of the garage could seep through walls and cracks to find me. Later that evening, Marcus confided that he'd been having trouble sleeping, too. He admitted in a hushed tone that he felt constantly watched, and that the atmosphere in the house was starting to affect his concentration. He wondered if there might be some logical explanation, a draft causing the doors to rattle, or perhaps electrical issues causing the lights to flicker. Deep down, though, I knew he was as uneasy as I was, suspecting a presence we couldn't see or define. I resolved to gather any leftover materials from the garage as quickly as possible, determined to finish the job and be free of its dreadful aura. The final day of work arrived, and I steeled myself with a grim sense of purpose. Moving swiftly, I carried boxes and tools out of that garage, focusing on the repetitiveness of the action to keep my anxiety in check. My hands shook as I gripped each box, and I felt as if every nerve ending in my body had been set to high alert. The sense of oppression grew with every minute I spent in there. At one point, I heard a faint whisper, too soft to make out words, but intense enough to rattle my composure. My chest tightened and my breathing turned shallow. I glanced around the space, shining my flashlight into every corner, feeling my heartbeat slam against my ribcage. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, almost with a life of their own, melting away from the flashlight beam, only to reappear behind me. By late afternoon, I had cleared most of the debris. All that remained was that ancient cabinet, now forcibly removed from its corner. It stood near the entrance, its doors ajar, revealing only emptiness inside. The locksmith had taken off the old lock days earlier, and I thought we would dispose of the entire piece of furniture. Yet something about it felt quietly menacing, as if removing it from its original spot had provoked whatever intangible force dwelled within. As I approached, my throat tightened, and I found myself sweating profusely. I could hear my ragged breaths, feel each pounding throb of my heart in my chest. Adrenaline surged, urging me to drop everything and flee. Still, I forced myself to place my hands on the cabinet's rough edges, intending to drag it toward the door. The wood felt ice cold against my palms, sending a numbing chill through my fingers. My vision blurred for a moment, and I sensed movement to my left. I snapped my head in that direction, heart leaping into my throat. Nothing was there, but the impression of being surrounded by something malevolent only intensified. My breathing came in labored gasps. In the stale, suffocating air of that garage, I felt as though the walls were closing in, stifling any hope of rational thought. Summoning the last of my nerve, I yanked the cabinet across the cement floor. The scraping noise resonated in the enclosed space, amplifying my anxiety. Every second felt like an eternity. My muscles tensed and my teeth clenched, so hard my jaw started to ache. Finally, I managed to push the cabinet out onto the driveway, where Marcus helped me load it onto a pickup. He looked as pale and shaken as I felt. We agreed not to keep it, not to fix it, but to get rid of it entirely. Although I dreaded the idea that disposing of it might not erase the strange aura we had experienced, I allowed myself a flicker of relief once it was off the property. My hands still trembled, and beads of sweat dotted my forehead. Each breath felt sharper than the last. That evening, I packed my things and decided I could no longer stay in that house. My nerves were frayed, and I needed distance from those oppressive walls. Marcus was of a similar mind. He planned to hire professionals to finish the renovation. The unease in his voice made it clear he suspected the house itself might never truly feel like a home. We parted ways, both of us displaying an unspoken acceptance that something beyond our understanding lingered there. Even after leaving, I couldn't fully shake the feeling that I had carried a piece of that darkness with me. That night, in the safety of my own apartment, I jolted awake to the imagined sound of scraping wood and the flicker of a bulb. My heart droomed painfully, echoing the memory of that shape in the window. I had to switch on every light as if afraid the shadows might move on their own again. The tension refused to leave my body, and I spent hours staring at the ceiling, recalling every chilling detail. Days later, I still catch myself avoiding mirrors or reflective surfaces in dimly lit rooms. My mind replays that image of the silhouette standing just behind me, as though it's a stain I can't scrub clean. I question my own sanity. Did I truly see what I think I saw? Or did fear and suggestion conjure it from the depths of my imagination? Each time I try to rationalize it, a shudder runs through my spine, reminding me of the tangible cold that wrapped around me in that garage. I haven't returned to that house since. Marcus called me once, mentioning that he sometimes hears strange sounds at night, no matter what fixes he implements. He claimed that one day he found the garage door inexplicably open, even though he had locked it the evening before. I told him to be cautious, my voice betraying the lingering paranoia that still gnawed at me. The memory of that cabinet, the silhouette, and the pervasive sense of being observed remain painfully vivid. Even though I escaped physically unharmed, a lingering tension still coils in my chest whenever I recall the stolly air of that place. An insidious discomfort stays with me, a reminder that not all presences can be explained away by logic or reason. There are spaces in this world, corners of old houses, stretches of darkness behind locked doors, where something watches from the shadows, unseen but undeniably real. And sometimes simply knowing it's there is enough to change everything. A single bulb swung overhead, casting shadows that danced along the hallway walls like silent sentinels of dread. From the moment I first set foot in that house, a faded structure, built in the 1940s, I felt something coil in my chest. The air was heavy, like the stale breath of a sealed tomb, and every room seemed to harbor its own secrets. Even before I moved in, I sensed it wasn't just old wood and chipped paint that lingered in those dark corners. There was a presence, intangible yet undeniable, haunting the corridors and tainting the atmosphere with a quiet malice. I never planned to stay long in that house. It was just a transitional place, cheap rent, a temporary fix, while I figured out my next steps in life. Yet, almost immediately, I understood why the rent was so low. The landlord casually mentioned that the previous owner insisted on partial renovations, claiming certain parts of the second floor were structurally insecure. He even told me that some of the doors upstairs were missing their door knobs. They'd been removed during the renovation, then jammed shut because real repairs never happened. At that time, I dismissed it as a quaint quirk of an old home, not worth more than a shrug. My first night was quiet enough to lull me into a false sense of security. The floorboards groaned under my steps as I moved my meager belongings into the upstairs bedroom, the only one that still had a functioning door handle. Outside, the wind rustled through the old trees, but inside the silence felt too complete. My chest felt tight and I kept finding myself swallowing hard, my throat inexplicably dry. I chalked it up to nerves. I was in a new environment after all. The second night, however, things began to change. I was awakened around 2 o'clock in the morning by what sounded like a door slamming. I jolted upright, heart pounding as if I'd just run a marathon. My pulse throbbed in my temples, and I could feel the warm surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. It took me a moment to shake off the fog of sleep. Another slam echoed down the hallway. It was as though someone was yanking a heavy door open and shut with force. Booty remembered the landlord's caution. The doors upstairs were wedged shut. They had no knobs. They shouldn't move at all, let alone slam. Breath catching in my throat, I eased myself out of bed. My feet touched the cold wood floor and a chill shot up my legs. I stood by the door of my bedroom, straining to hear any further noise. My ears were ringing from the sudden rush of blood and the absolute stillness that followed. For a moment, I wondered if I had only dreamed the sound. Yet, the fear was too real, sitting in my gut like a lead weight. The hallway was dark, save for the faint glow from a small sconce near the top of the stairs. That dim flickering light did nothing to soothe my nerves. When I finally mustered the courage to open my bedroom door, I stepped into the corridor and felt the distinct sensation of being watched. My scalp prickled as though unseen eyes were observing my every move. I stood there, breath shallow, muscles tensed, waiting for something, anything, to show itself. But the corridor was still. The closed doors remained shut, exactly as they should have been, with no sign of movement. Telling myself it must have been the wind rattling the old structure, I returned to bed. Yet, the persistent feeling of unease clung to me like a wet blanket, making sleep elusive. The slamming began to recur on subsequent nights, always at roughly the same hour. The repetitive nature of it tore at my nerves. It started quietly sometimes, like a faint clap, then crescendoed into violent blows that seemed to shake the walls. I reached out at the landlord in a text, asking if maybe a draft was to blame, or if there were animals in the house. He answered, indirectly, mentioning that the old place had its quirks, and that the original owner used to speak of noises at night, but nothing was ever proven. He also reiterated that the upper doors were definitely jammed shut. I spent several sleepless nights, haunted by a sound that defied any logical explanation. One evening, desperate for clarity, I decided to inspect those sealed rooms more closely. I waited until dusk, when the house's shadows grew long, as though it was preparing to show me its darkest secrets. My heart thudded as I approached the nearest door that lacked a knob. It was barely ajar, just a thin gap revealing blackness within. I leaned my shoulder against it, giving a careful push. It resisted at first, scraping along the floor in a stubborn protest. Then it gave way, revealing a small, unused room filled with dusty boxes and old furniture draped in sheets. The stench of stale and mold invaded my nostrils, causing me to gag reflexively. Inside, the atmosphere felt stagnant, almost suffocating. My breath quickened, and I could feel cool sweat forming at my hairline. Nothing looked out of place. Yet, the hairs on my arms stood upright, and a chill slithered up my spine. I scanned the walls and the ceiling, half expecting to see something nearly crouched in the corner. But there was only darkness and the lifeless shapes of covered chairs. I didn't linger. Slamming the door shut again, I felt a disconcerting jolt of resistance, as though something on the other side was pushing back. But the moment passed, and I fled down the hall, not daring to glance behind me. Over the following week, I became hyper-aware of every sound the house produced. Each creak of the floor, each sigh of the old beams made my pulse spike. My sleep became shallow, peppered with bursts of wakefulness. Whenever I detected a shift in the silence, I started noticing small changes in the hallway each morning. A door slightly more open than before, or the sconce flickering at irregular intervals. I reminded myself that the windows might be letting in drafts, or that the electrical wiring was just ancient. Yet my nerves remained on edge, and I felt as though I was spiraling into paranoia. One particularly restless night, I lay in bed, heart pounding when the slamming returned with renewed intensity. I could feel the vibrations through the mattress, like distant thunder shaking the ground. My skin prickled and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. Summoning every shred of courage, I grabbed a flashlight and dashed into the hallway. The corridor felt colder than usual, as if an arctic wind had found its way inside. My teeth chattered. Involuntarily, I followed the sound to one of the sealed doors at the far end. It appeared slightly open, although I knew for a fact I had wedged it shut earlier in the day. I inched closer, my legs trembled, and my stomach twisted into a knot. The door shuttered, moving back and forth, as though caught in a violent gust. But there was no wind, no draft. The corridor was enclosed, the windows locked. My hands shook so hard that the flashlight's beam wavered across the walls like a frantic pulse, mustering the nerve to peek through the gap. I caught sight of movement within. A shadow, tall and distorted, slid across the room's interior wall. I jerked back, heart pounding so fiercely I could hear it in my ears. My hand gripped the door, but an icy force seemed to push it wider, revealing more darkness within. A dull throb filled my head, and my breathing became shallow. Each inhale, a struggle against the suffocating dread. I swung the flashlight beam inside, but it illuminated only the same old furniture in a boarded-up window. The shadow, if it was even real, had vanished. Yet, I couldn't shake the tangible fear that something was in that room with me. The air felt charged, as though an electric current rippled just out of sight. Desperately, I yanked the door shut, jamming it so hard that the hinges squealed. Then, I ran back to my room, slamming my own door and pressing my back against it. Chest heaving, heart pounding against my ribs. The following days felt like an eternity. I found myself double-checking all the doors each night, placing makeshift wedges beneath them, hoping to keep them sealed. Sleep became a luxury. My eyes grew bloodshot from exhaustion, and my mind wandered into dark corners, conjuring images of impossible shapes lurking behind the walls. My dreams, when I managed to doze off, were filled with spinning corridors and doorways leading to endless black voids. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart thrashing against my ribcage, convinced that something had been hovering over me in the darkness. I tried mentioning these incidents to a friend over the phone. Speaking in hushed, urgent tones, they suggested it might be stress, that perhaps my imagination was running wild in an unfamiliar place. I almost believed them until the night I saw one of those doorways wide open. I was heading downstairs for a glass of water, fighting the dryness in my throat when I noticed the corridor seemed off. The sconce flickered and I realized that the farthest door, one I had blocked carefully, stood ajar by nearly a foot. My legs turned to jelly and every hair on my body stood on end. For a minute, I stood there frozen, thoughts tumbling over one another in sheer terror. I crept toward it, compelled by a mix of dread and a twisted need to confirm my own sanity. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps the wedge slipped, or maybe I had done a poor job securing it, but deep down, I felt that heavy, smothering presence again, as though something intangible was staring right back at me from the darkness within. The silence stretched out, thick as tar, pressing against my eardrums. My breathing grew uneven, chest tight. I wanted to call out for help, but my throat felt constricted, no sound emerging. In a moment of grim determination, I reached for the door, intending to slam it shut, but my hand froze an inch from the bare wood. An evaporating chill seeped through the gap like a wave of frigid air emanating from the room. My flashlight, trembling in my other hand, barely penetrated the gloom. Then a faint sound reached my ears. A kind of scraping or sliding, as though something heavy was being dragged along the floor. My scalp prickled, and I found myself taking a step back, primal fear coursing through every nerve. I told myself I couldn't live like this. With my pulse racing, I retreated to my bedroom, locked the door, and spent the remainder of the night cowering in the corner, flashlight aimed at the threshold. The house remained eerily silent until dawn, as though mocking me with the knowledge that daylight offered no real protection. I realized I needed to confront this, or I'd lose my mind entirely. Determined to put an end to it, I planned a final, thorough inspection of every sealed room by daylight. Armed with a crowbar and an unwavering resolve not to back down, I marched to the first room, my heart hammered in my chest, but I forced myself to pry the door fully open. Dust mote spiraled in the dull glow of morning. Inside, aside from old boxes and the battered dresser, there was nothing. I moved on to the next door, repeating the process, finding similarly mundane contents. Yet the atmosphere remained oppressive, suffused with a silent hostility I couldn't define. Finally, I arrived at the last room, the one where I had seen that flicker of movement. Its door groaned in protest, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. Inside, I found an empty space. No furniture, just a cracked wall and a boarded-up window. The floorboards bore marks, scratches perhaps from some heavy object being dragged across them. My breath caught and a wave of nausea rocked me as I realized these scratches looked fresh. A sudden chill coursed through the room. My knees went weak and I gripped the crowbar for support. I felt that charged presence again, suffocating in its intensity. The walls seemed to press in around me. I could almost hear a faint hum like the static off an old TV. In that moment, I felt an inexplicable compulsion to leave, as though staying any longer would snap the final threat of my sanity. I staggered back into the hallway, slamming the door behind me with a force that sent dust showering from the ceiling. Enough was enough. My body trembled from the adrenaline. My vision blurred with tears of frustration and dread. Without a second thought, I gathered what possessions I could carry immediately and left the house. As I fumbled with the keys in the lock, I imagined I heard the faintest of creaks from upstairs, as if a door was swinging open on its own. I refused to look back. Over the next few days, I made arrangements to relocate. I contacted the landlord, explained in measured, indirect words that I was leaving. I hinted at the disturbances, making no mention of the ominous presence, but he seemed unsurprised, almost resigned. After I transferred to a new place, I had recurring nightmares for weeks, visions of those door knobless thresholds gaping open, a cold wind whispering across the floor, beckoning me to return. Even far away, the memory of that house weighed on me, gnawing at my nerves whenever silence stretched too long. Sometimes late at night, I catch myself replaying those experiences in my mind, heart rate spiking. I recall the slamming doors and the cold presence in the upstairs corridor. I wonder if I imagine the entire thing, if perhaps a combination of stress and the loneliness of that old building created illusions. But deep down I still feel that intangible menace, that silent gaze that once followed me through the dark hall. I'm convinced something ancient and malevolent lingered there, thriving in the cracks of that 1940s structure, feeding on the fear that humans carry with them. Though I escaped physically, my psyche still remains tethered to that place. At odd moments, I'll think I hear a phantom slam echo in my new home. My breath will catch in my throat, and a cold shiver will course down my spine. That echo in my memory reminds me that some doors once opened never really close. And even if they have no handles, they can still swing wide in the dead of night, exposing the darkness that lurks on the other side. I awoke on the first night, with my heart pounding so fiercely that it seemed to shake my entire chest. Darkness choked the room, and for an instant I had no idea where I was or why my skin felt icy against the sheets. My thoughts scrambled until I remembered. I was in an old hotel tucked away in a region famous for its preserved 19th century architecture. The air tasted stale, as though the walls had witnessed countless secrets they refused to relinquish. That feeling of something pressing in on me from every angle. An unshakable heaviness clung to me like a damp fog. There was no comfort in that gloom, only the sharp sting of unease that scuttled along my spine. I had come here on business, expecting a few nights in relative isolation, so I could focus on my tasks without the usual city chaos. The building's exterior had the kind of grandeur you might see in antique postcards, elaborate stone masonry, tall windows with carved frames, and a wrought-iron balcony attached to what would be my room. From the outside, I found it charming in a haunted sort of way. By the time I stepped into the lobby, though, I sensed that the old charm carried a weight, something beyond simple age. High ceilings with fading fresco towered above a check-in counter. There was a hush in the place, an odd hush that every footstep seemed to amplify rather than break. The receptionist looked pleasantly tired, as though part of her had grown accustomed to existing in half-light. I barely remember our initial exchange, only that she directed me down a very long corridor to the last room on the left. My shoes tapped against warped floorboards, and the hallway itself felt narrower than it should, as if the walls were angled just so. Each step toward that final door brought a growing sense of reluctance, but I dismissed it as simple travel fatigue. Once inside, I tossed my suitcase on the floor, clicked it on a table lamp, and saw the double doors leading to the balcony. The wood was deeply scratched near the doorknobs, and the glass panes rattled when I tested the handle. Beyond it, a sliver of the night sky revealed itself. I didn't dare step outside just yet. Something about that balcony with its rusted metal railing gave me a chill I couldn't rationalize. Still, I was exhausted. The bed creaked as I sat down, the mattress much softer than I expected. My limbs felt impossibly heavy, and I told myself to ignore the creeping apprehension. The moment I laid my head down, that hush returned, a stifling silence that pressed inward, crowding my thoughts. I drifted off with images of the hallways, flickering wall sconces dancing behind my eyelids. Then came the second night when I truly understood that something was wrong. During the day, I had been out handling my assignments. I barely spent time in the room, preferring to linger in the hotel's small cafe or step outside for fresh air. But by late evening, after a long day, I trudged back to that end of the hall room, shoulders aching from tension I couldn't release. Once inside, I noticed how the carpet near the bed was slightly frayed, revealing older floorboards beneath. I remember being oddly fascinated by that worn spot, but drowsiness soon overcame me, and I collapsed onto the bed. Sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning, my eyes snapped open. The lamp was off just as I had left it, but I felt an immediate awareness that I wasn't alone. It was like the air density changed, disturbed by another presence. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My heart thudded, as if it wanted to break free from my ribcage. I lay there paralyzed, unsure if I had been startled by a nightmare or something real. Then there was a sensation of weight at the foot of the bed, as though someone or something had perched itself there. My breath caught in my throat. The darkness felt alive, shifting and bearing down on my senses. I fumbled for the switch on the bedside lamp, nearly knocking it over in the process. Light flared, revealing the foot of the bed. Nothing. The blanket was smooth, no indentations where a form should have been. The room seemed innocently empty, but my pulse insisted otherwise. My mouth went dry as I reached for a glass of water on the small table. It rattled against my teeth when I took a sip. I told myself that I must have been half asleep, imagining shapes in the void. Still, I couldn't shake the deep instinctive dread. After a few minutes of surveying every shadowy corner, I forced myself to switch off the lamp, telling my racing mind to calm down. The moment darkness returned, however, I heard faint footsteps. They were soft and careful, as if someone tiptoed across the old wooden floor. Each step seemed to circle the bed with intervals of silence that made my heart skip in fearful anticipation. I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my eardrums. My hands gripped the sheets, sweat trickling down my temples. For several long minutes, or possibly hours, I had no sense of time. I remained motionless. My body was pinned to the mattress by a fear so intense it caused my muscles to burn. When the footsteps finally ceased, I dared to peek at the clock. It was 3:07 a.m. at the ceiling until the pale morning light began to seep around the heavy curtains. At dawn, everything seemed normal again, as if the night had been a strange illusion. Still, my nerves were frayed. While making my way to the front desk, I rehearsed how to ask about strange occurrences without sounding ridiculous. Eventually, I approached the receptionist, describing a restless night and inquiring if other guests had reported odd noises. She offered a small, strange smile and vaguely admitted that many visitors had experienced unusual disturbances. There was no elaboration, no comfort, just that half-hearted acknowledgement. That brief exchange made my anxiety flare all over. Again, the following evening, an intense weariness shadowed me. Yet, I dreaded returning to that room, imagining the footsteps and the heavy silence. Upon entering, the first thing I noticed was a damp chill in the air. Even though the radiator hissed with heat, the atmosphere felt clammy and cold. I double-checked the double doors to the balcony to ensure they were locked. The wind must have been blowing outside because the glass shuttered intermittently, creating a faint rhythmic tapping. Each tap felt synchronized with my escalating pulse. In an attempt to ease my mind, I decided to inspect every corner of the room, shining the small flashlight I carried for emergencies. The wallpaper, floral in design, but faded and peeling in places, seemed to shift under the beams, if alive with its own secrets. In the bathroom, the faucet dripped steadily, and no matter how tightly I turned the knob, it never stopped fully. I felt like I was part of an endless cycle of ominous sights and sounds, dripping water, tapping glass, creaking floorboards, all the while my sense of being watched never dissipated. When it was finally time to try sleeping, my muscles felt too tense to allow me any rest. I found myself lying awake, fixated on the patterns of shadows cast by the street light outside. Those shadows swayed across the wall in shapes that my fear-twisted mind interpreted as looming figures. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I slipped into a tormented half-sleep. I dreamed of the corridor outside in this unsettling vision. The hallway elongated with the walls closing in, and I felt pinned in place. I couldn't breathe, just stare at the old patterned carpet that seemed to undulate beneath my feet. A sudden gust of wind rattled the balcony doors, jolting me awake. Again, my eyes darted around, adjusting to the darkness. This time, an overpowering sense of dread consumed me before I even heard anything. Sure enough, the faintest shuffle of steps began. A deliberate tread that circled me in a nauseatingly slow orbit. There was a persistent scraping sound, too, like a chair being dragged lightly across the floor, but the direction was impossible to pinpoint. I clenched my teeth against the urge to shout, knowing that my voice might only feed my terror. My entire body trembled, and chills coursed down my spine, leaving goosebumps along my arms. By the time morning arrived, I had barely slept, determined to escape the suffocating atmosphere. I wandered the streets 4 hours during the day. I studied the old architecture, tried to immerse myself in local history. Yet, every now and then, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if eyes tracked my every step. When I returned to the hotel lobby that afternoon, my stomach twisted upon seeing the corridor again. The wallpaper's colors seemed duller, the corners darker, and the lights overhead flickered as I passed beneath them. On the fourth night, the tension reached an unbearable peak. I lay in bed, fully clothed, too anxious to fall asleep. I heard the radiator groan and hiss in the corner. For a while, it was just that mechanical hum and the occasional drip from the bathroom. Then, around the same time as always, just after 2 in the morning, I felt a sudden plunge in temperature. My breath came out in ragged puffs. The foot of the bed sank under a weight again, but this time it moved toward me. It was as if a presence crawled across the mattress, compressing the springs one by one. My heart hammered so violently that I feared it would burst. Sweat soaked my shirt. Too terrified to open my eyes, I tried to focus on controlling my breathing, but I could practically hear my pulse in my ears. Then a soft gust of air brushed against my face, as if someone hovered inches away. My breath caught in my throat again. I forced my eyes open only to see a vague shape blocking my view of the opposite wall. The outline was indistinct, but it felt undeniably human, crouched at my bedside. My stomach clenched and an icy jolt of pure panic coursed through me. In a desperate surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the lamp. By the time the light flicked on, there was nothing. The air no longer felt cold, and the bed appeared undisturbed. I couldn't remain still. My hands shook as I threw the covers aside and bolted upright. The entire room seemed to spin, and I felt on the edge of fainting. The reflection in the mirror above the dresser looked foreign, a man drenched in sweat, eyes wide with fear. I dared to glance at the balcony doors. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of moonlight cut through a gap, illuminating the rug by the doors. Something glimmered there, like faint footprints outlined by silver beams. I blinked repeatedly, and the footprints vanished as though never there. At dawn, after packing my bag with trembling fingers, I went downstairs and stated I needed to check out early. The receptionist looked at me with understanding, yet her expression betrayed no surprise. In indirect words, she mentioned how guests who chose that room often left sooner than intended. She implied there were numerous accounts of visitors hearing voices, footsteps, or witnessing strange apparitions. I noticed her gaze drifting to the old ledger behind the counter. Its pages yellowed from age. My stomach sank at thought of how many had endured the same harrowing nights. To calm myself before leaving, I visited the dining area for one last cup of coffee. A musty scent hovered in the air, the antique chairs and warm carpeting exuding their decades of silent burden. I couldn't help imagining phantoms in the corners or the presence of a restless entity that had latched onto me. By the time I finished that coffee, my hands had finally stopped shaking, though a knot of anxiety still twisted in my gut. As I gathered my belongings and waited for a taxi outside, the wind whipped around the old balconies overhead. The iron railings creaked in the breeze, a shrill lament that felt almost accusatory. I looked up at my room's balcony and saw the curtain shifting, though the windows were closed. My heart pounded anew, the memory of those footprints, and that hazy shape flaring in my mind. The taxi pulled up, offering my only path to escape the suffocating pull of that hotel's centuries-old gloom. The ride away from that place was saturated with a sickening combination of relief and lingering dread. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shapeless figure leaning over the edge of the bed. Every time the car hit a small bump, my stomach lurched as if gravity were punishing me for what I'd witnessed. In the depths of my mind, I wondered whether I'd unwittingly carried something away with me, a residue of fear that would never fully wash off. Back in my own apartment later that day, I unpacked my clothes, trying to move on as though all of it were a bad dream. Yet the memory clung, the oppressive silence, the creeping footsteps, the intangible weight that pressed down on me in the dead of night. Whenever I drifted to sleep in my own bed, I half expected to feel that same presence returning, placing itself at the foot of my blankets and breathing softly against my skin. My body tensed just from imagining it. I found myself checking for shadows beneath the door, leaving my lamp on well into the small hours of morning. 4 days, I lived in a state of restless anticipation, as though I were waiting for an encore of that experience. A small part of me questioned whether I had merely fallen victim to exhaustion and a suggestible mind. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more vivid the recollections became, the dragging steps, the temperature dropping, like a sudden wintry gust, the sensation of being watched intently from the darkest corner of the room. Even now, whenever I think about that old hotel with its looming presence and its labyrinth of corridors, my heart beats faster and the hair on my arms rises. There is a weight attached to the memory, as if that place has stitched itself into my psyche. No matter how I try to bury it beneath work or everyday routines, the memory surfaces in my nightmares, a constant reminder that some corners of this world harbor energies we cannot fully explain. I didn't leave that place with physical scars, but the psychological impact lingers like a bruise on my spirit. Sometimes I question my sanity. Did he hallucinate those footsteps, conjure them from my own anxieties, or did something truly linger in that room, something eager to make its presence known to those who sleep in the last room at the end of the corridor? I'll never seek confirmation, never step foot in that ancient structure again. The unanswered questions are almost worse than any certainty, but I can't bring myself to return to that haunted suite of creaking floors, flickering lights, and nightly terrors. It's enough to know that even in the daylight, safe in my own home, I can't fully convince myself it wasn't real. That oppressive hush, that invisible weight, those faint circling steps, they remain embedded in my consciousness. A testament to the unsettling truth that some places never let you go. The first time I set foot in that house, I felt as though I'd inhaled an entire lungful of stale, suffocating air. The evening sky was a mix of dull purple and darkening clouds, and even the trees seemed to lean in as if trying to hear what lurks behind those warped wooden walls. The house stood at the end of a rooted dirt road with a porch that sagged like it carried secrets too heavy for its beams. There was no doubt something was off about the place. The hush that fell over me was not comforting, but claustrophobic, like stepping into a cavern deep underground. All I could think was that something inside did not want to be disturbed. My brother had purchased this property a month earlier, boasting that he'd found a steal. Theplin was to renovate it over the summer, turn it into a rustic getaway for weekends, when we both needed a break from city life. But from the moment I set my bags down in the narrow hallway, I noticed a prickling at the back of my neck. The space smelled faintly of damp wood, and something accurate I couldn't identify. Fluorescent bulbs in the overhead fixture gave off a pale, sickly light, and I imagined shadows dancing in corners that were actually quite still. I told myself I was being paranoid, but hair felt too thick to be normal summer humidity. At first, the signs of trouble were small, doors that would drift shut with a soft click when I could have sworn they were left wide open. Faucets in the bathroom or kitchen dripping irregularly, then stopping the moment I approached. I tried to joke about it with my brother, telling him we just needed to fix the old pipes and level the floors. He shrugged it off, but I could see a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. The house was built decades ago, maybe more than a century, so a little quirkiness was expected, but it was more than that. There was a presence, or perhaps just the suggestion of one, in every empty room. I remember one particular night just a few days after I'd arrived. I was in my bedroom, trying to read by the warm glow of a small lamp, when I heard distinct creaking overhead. The volume was low but unmistakable, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps across old boards. My stomach clenched as I listened. The attic was directly above me, though no one should have been up there. The access was a rickety trapdoor in the hallway ceiling, which I had to reach by a squeaky folding ladder. I'd attempted to peek up there once, but the dusty emptiness was unnerving, and I left quickly, coughing from the swirling debris. Yet now, in the dead of night, it sounded like something was pacing. My heart hammered so loud I could hardly hear myself breathe. I forced myself to stand, 1 foot numb from sitting cross-legged. I crept down the hallway. The house groaned in several places, each squeal of a floorboard, exaggerating how alone I felt in that darkness. I glanced at the closed door to my brother's room. He was a heavy sleeper, and I didn't want to wake him over what might just be my imagination. The entire time, I felt as though I was being watched from above. My scalp tingled when I stood under the attic trapdoor. It looked ordinary enough, just a square panel in the ceiling. My breathing quickened. An awful scenario played in my head. Something leaning down, waiting. I told myself it was ridiculous. Nobody was actually there. So, I took a breath, exhaled, and reached for the folding ladder. I extended the ladder, each metallic scrape sounding louder than a thunderclap in that hush. When I opened the trapdoor, dust spilled down, making me sneeze. I felt goosebumps spread over my arms and legs. Once the initial wave of dust settled, I peeked into the blackness. I had a weak flashlight, but the circle of light revealed nothing. Just rafters, more cobwebs, and scattered bits of old junk. No footsteps, no figure, no sign of intrusion. After a moment of tense silence, I backed away and closed the trapdoor. The attic didn't feel like a place meant for people to linger, and I was eager to leave it alone. Things only became stranger. My brother, who had mostly dismissed my nervousness, started to notice anomalies of his own. He mentioned hearing low thuds in the walls, like something shifting inside the structure. He thought maybe squirrels or rats were making nests, but found no evidence of droppings or gnaw marks. Some nights, he'd be in the living room trying to watch old DVDs for lack of a decent TV signal, and claim he could see movement from the corner of his eye. Shadows flitting across the hallway. Whenever he turned, there'd be nothing. he'd mutter about it, then shake his head, uncertain if he was just worn out from the constant renovation work. I tried to keep myself busy during the day, rearranging furniture and helping with small repairs. But that nagging sense of being watched never quite disappeared. Every so often, a cold spike of fear would stab through my gut for no apparent reason. I'd spin around half expecting to catch someone peering in from outside, but the windows always revealed the same rolling fields and distant treine. In the afternoon, sunlight flooded through the windows, and the house felt almost normal, yet, come evening, the corridors darkened, and the atmosphere turned oppressive again. The worst part was that attic. My brother and I tried to forget about it, but it became impossible after a certain evening when he heard a loud crash above us. He came to me, his face pale, saying we had to investigate because it sounded like something heavy had toppled over. My heartbeat jumped to double time, but I agreed we should check. I grabbed a crowbar, feeling foolish, but also unwilling to go unarmed into the attic. He took a flashlight and some gloves in case we needed to clear out debris. We climbed the folding ladder, the hinges squealing in protest. Each rung felt like a step deeper into something I wasn't sure I wanted to confront. The attic reeked of musty insulation, and the dust floated around us in strange, shimmering clouds whenever our flashlight beams cut through the shadows. We poked around for a good 10 minutes, brushing aside cobwebs and rummaging through stacks of forgotten boxes. An old trunk sat in the corner, sealed with a rusty lock, but we had no reason to force it open. Aside from that trunk, there were only broken chairs, a stained mattress, and random scraps of wood. Nothing looked out of place or freshly toppled, no sign of anything that could have produced that loud crash. Still, my brother and I shared a look of unease. Something was off. Our flashlights flickered against the walls, revealing old inscriptions carved into the wooden support beams. I couldn't make them out clearly. Some looked like random initials, others like strange symbols, worn and indecipherable. A hush fell over us, and I felt my palms grow slick with sweat around the crowbar's handle. Then, in that silence came a soft scuttling sound from the darkness behind us. We spun around aiming our lights wildly, but we saw only the swirling dust. In my peripheral vision, I caught a glimpse of something shifting behind a stack of boxes. My chest squeezed so tight I could barely breathe. We stood still for what felt like minutes, but it was probably only seconds, hearts hammering, as the silence returned. Eventually, we backed away, closed a trap door, and locked it, hoping that was enough. Neither of us slept well that night. The house was too quiet, yet every little creak in the floor or rattle of the wind against the windows made me jolt upright. My mind played tricks on me, conjuring all sorts of scenarios about what roamed that attic after dark. I found myself trembling in bed, covered in a layer of cold sweat. My stomach nodded. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard the faint patter of footsteps above me. To ease our nerves, we decided to reinforce the attic locks and replace the old skylight up there, figuring that maybe the structure had been compromised, allowing animals to slip in. We spent a day removing the broken glass of the ancient skylight. The job was messy, with shards slipping dangerously close to my arms and face. I was grateful for thick gloves and a heavy work shirt. Even so, as I worked in that cramped, stale space, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding on something, like the house resented our attempts to modernize it. My brother even joked, in a half-hearted way, that the house might prefer us gone. I couldn't laugh. That night, I realized the repairs didn't calm my nerves at all. If anything, the tension grew. The sense that something prowled through those empty rooms became unbearable. I began to dread nightfall. My heart would pound uncontrollably from dusk onward, as if anticipating something I couldn't name. Sometimes I would find myself pacing the hall, palms clammy, an absurd wave of claustrophobia washing over me. I'd feel corners of my vision flicker, like shapes with their one moment on Goni the next. Once, while washing dishes, I felt hot breath on my neck. I whipped around so fast, I nearly sent a plate crashing to the floor. Of course, no one was there. My brother was faring no better. He said he could hardly concentrate on the tasks at hand, and confided in me that at times he questioned his own sanity. At one point he recalled hearing a muffled voice in the middle of the night, as if someone was whispering directly into his ear. He insisted it wasn't a dream. He bolted upright in bed, certain the presence hovered by his pillow. But when he flipped on the lamp, there was no one in sight. He told me he wasn't sure if we should stay in the house any longer. Maybe it was worth calling an inspector or even a priest, anything to rid us of this creeping dread. The following week blurred into a stretch of restless sleep and anxious days. I would sit by the window in the late afternoon, sweaty and shaking from the build-up of tension, my eyes scanning the yard for any sign of movement. Sometimes, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the fence line or a figure in the tree line. But the moment I blinked, it was gone. My mouth felt perpetually dry, as if all the moisture in my body was being sapped away by that house. One night, everything seemed to escalate. I was trying to sleep, my heart thudding in my chest like a jackhammer. The silence in the house was absolute, but then a faint rhythmic tapping began overhead. My skin prickled. I tried to bury my head under the pillow, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It felt like a call beckoning me to the attic. My body trembled, a cold sweat soaking my shirt. My breath came in shallow gasps. I told myself not to go up there, that it was better to ignore it. But that incessant tapping wouldn't let me rest. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and got out of bed. I silently approached the hallway, noticing that every hair on my arm stood on end. The darkness felt alive, pressing against me from all sides. I cursed myself for being so jumpy. Yet, I crept forward, each step more hesitant than the last. When I stood beneath the attic trapdoor, I felt the air shift, like a sudden drop in temperature. My breath came out in frosty puffs, and I realized the hallway had become inexplicably cold. The tapping continued for a moment, then stopped altogether, as if it sensed my presence. I reached for the ladder latch and pulled it down. The metal rungs unfolded, squeaking as usual. My heart hammered so fiercely I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. As I placed a foot on the first rung, my stomach churned, warning me not to do it, but I climbed anyway, my legs trembling with every step. I felt drenched in sweat despite the chill. My flashlight flickered when I clicked it on, the beam jittering across dusty beams and boxes. The attic was suffocatingly quiet. As I scanned the space, I noticed something new. Near the far corner by that old trunk, the floorboards were covered in strange white markings, almost like chalk outlines. They formed a disjointed circle, or maybe multiple overlapping circles. My flashlight cut out briefly, plunging me into darkness. My throat went dry, fear lancing through my entire body. Then the light flicked back on, if responding to my panic, and I saw that the lines extended across the floor, creeping onto the walls in archaic shapes. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. My vision swam, if I was on the edge of fainting. In my mind, I could almost sense a presence coiled there, intangible, but potent, filling the attic with a near physical weight. My breathing became shallow and I felt as though the air pressed against my chest, making it difficult to inhale. I took a step back, nearly tripping over a loose board. That was when a noise shattered the silence. A raspy sound like a faint exhale of breath, right beside my ear. I froze, paralyzed by terror, sweat trickling down my temple. My legs threatened to buckle beneath me, but I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the ladder. As soon as I reached the opening, I heard something scrape across the floor behind me, like a box being dragged. I didn't dare look back. I descended so fast I nearly missed a rung. When I hit the hallway floor, I slammed the trap door shut, heart pounding violently. My hand shook as I locked it, as if that flimsy mechanism could possibly keep whatever lurked up there away from me. After that, I retreated to my bedroom, pressing my back against the door, mind racing with the horrific possibilities of what was in that attic. The next day, my brother found me blurred and on edge. He asked if I had heard anything last night. Looking just as tired as I was, I explained in a halting voice what I'd seen, though I minimized the more outrageous details, afraid he'd think I was losing my mind. But he said he believed me. He'd woken in the early hours feeling like something was pressing down on his chest, as though the air itself had become a crushing weight that sealed our decision. We needed to leave. It wasn't rational to stay any longer in a place that was unraveling our sanity. We spent the afternoon packing our things, each of us glancing at the attic trapdoor as we moved through the hallway. The sense of being watched was constant, my shoulders prickling with tension every time we passed underneath that hidden space. I carried boxes to the car, feeling no shame in rushing, my breath shallow with each trip. The house seemed more oppressive than ever, its wooden bones groaning in protest, as if it knew we intended to abandon it. Even the shadows in the living room appeared to flicker and stretch across the walls, chasing us out. By late afternoon, the car was loaded, and we got ready to drive off. Before climbing into the passenger seat, I took one last look at the house. The porch seemed to droop even more and the windows were dark, reminding me of vacant eyes. I felt a chill ripple down my spine, and my heartbeat quickened once again. The air tasted sharp and metallic, a final warning from that place. As we backed away, I couldn't shake the sensation that something watched from the attic skylight, hidden behind the dusty glass we had installed. Resentful of our trespass, we left that remote property behind, but the unease remains with me to this day. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear those faint footsteps over my head, the tapping that escalates into something sinister. My chest tightens just remembering the stale scent of that attic, the cryptic white markings, and the intangible presence that wrapped cold fingers around me. Even in the comfort of my own apartment back in the city, I find myself glancing at the ceiling at odd hours, unable to banish the thought that maybe it followed me home. I never learned the full story of that house, or why it felt like something in the attic didn't want to be disturbed. Perhaps it was a manifestation of the house's history etched into the wood and dust. Or maybe my brother and I both succumbed to a kind of shared hysteria brought on by isolation and stress. But deep down, I suspect some secrets are meant to remain, hidden, confined to forgotten corners where sensible people dare not tread. I don't plan on returning to that place, and honestly, I'm not sure I'd have the courage, even if I wanted to. The memory of that attic is enough to raise goosebumps on my arms, and a faint echo of dread lingers whenever I think about what still dwells there. Pacing in the darkness, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to break its solitude, I remember the exact moment I realized something was deeply wrong in my home. It was the kind of realization that crawls over your skin like 1,000 tiny needles. My house sits near the end of a lonely dirt road with only a distant neighbor whose porch light flickers weakly through the trees on moonless nights. It's usually quiet out here, so quiet I can hear every creak in the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside, every animal that scurries across my driveway. That silence once felt comforting. Now it feels like a vacuum, one that pulls at me nerves until they are ready to snap. Because once you notice the subtle things, the odd shadows that move when there's no one there, the doorbell that rings with nobody outside, the quiet is no longer peaceful. It becomes an amplifier for fear, and that fear has consumed my nights. I have always been the type to stay up late. The hush of the early morning hours helps me think. Sometimes I catch the tail end of a movie, or I read through a stack of old magazines I find at yard sales. My routine was so ingrained that a ring at 2 o'clock in the morning was jarring to say the least. The first time it happened, I was sitting on my couch, surrounded by the faint glow of a single lamp. The rest of the house was dark, and I remember feeling that my eyes were burning from exhaustion. I flinched so hard at the sound of the doorbell that I almost dropped my mug on the floor. The ring was loud and shrill, like it was being pressed for too long. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, and an icy film of sweat clung to my palms. I tried telling myself that must be a stray traveler looking for directions, or maybe a neighbor in need of help, but I knew that was unlikely. The closest neighbor rarely spoke to me, and my property was so out of the way that lost travelers were practically non-existent. Despite the late hour, I forced myself to answer. At first, I just cracked open the front door and squinted into the darkness. My gate, roughly 40 feet from the porch, was locked with a heavy chain, and it was still firmly in place. The yard lamp illuminated the gate just enough for me to see that no one stood there. I felt my chest tighten. There was a primal urge to bolt back inside and lock everything. Instead, I took in a sharp breath and decided to walk the short path to the gate. The wet grass slapped against my ankles. The night air seeped into my lungs, impossibly cold. My breath became wispy clouds in front of me, swirling under the weak beam of the motion-activated light. When I reached the gate, I realized there was no sign of tampering. The chain was secure, the padlock in place. I listened for movement, footsteps, a rustle of clothing, any hint of an intruder. Instead, I only heard the wind brushing through the tall pines that tower around the property. My heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. It felt like an eternity before I finally convinced myself that no one was there. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if a pair of unseen eyes were studying me from beyond the shadows. Every hair on my neck stood on end, and my fingers tingled with that frantic energy that surges when you sense a threat. I turned and walked back to the house. My footsteps were rapid, practically a jog by the time I reached the porch. Inside, I closed the door behind me and locked it, leaning against the wood until I felt the slight tremor in my legs subside. The silence pressed around me once more, and I could hear my own labored breathing filling the room. Just as I tried to steady myself, the doorbell rang again. My heart beat violently. The timing was cruel, like someone was waiting until I felt the faintest hint of relief before striking again. My breath caught in my throat, and this time I didn't open the door. I listened, pressing my ear against the cold wood, waiting for the sound of footsteps on the porch. But there was only stillness, and then a sudden breeze that rattled the windows. Part of me wanted to fling the door open, just to prove there was nothing there. But the rest of me was too paralyzed by the idea that something could be standing right outside, waiting to jump at me the moment I turned the knob. When I finally gathered enough courage to look, the yard was as empty as before. The gate loomed in the distance, locked. The patches of trees around the property rustled faintly. No sign of life, no sign of anything out of place except for that prickling sense of dread that refused to leave my spine. My ears strained, expecting to hear it again. A third ring, but it didn't come immediately. Instead, an hour passed, then almost another. I tried to distract myself with meaningless tasks, rearranging books on the shelf, flipping through television channels, pacing aimlessly. Every creak of the house made my stomach lurch. My imagination turned every soft thump into a monstrous footstep, every distant rustle into someone creeping around the walls. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I decided I couldn't take any more. I grabbed a screwdriver, turned off the breaker that supplied the doorbell, and disconnected the wire behind the switch. I expected silence to follow. But 10 minutes later, the ring came again, shrill, abrupt, and paralyzing. I stood therein, the dimly lit hallway, staring at the doorbell mechanism I had just dismantled, trying to process how it was still making noise. My heart hammered so violently, I could feel the pulse in my temples. Each ring sent a jolt through my chest. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a technical glitch or a short circuit, but the growing sense of unease suggested otherwise, planting the notion that something else was messing with me in a way that defied logic. The rest of the night was unbearable. The bell rang sporadically until the sky began to lighten. Sometimes it would be 20 minutes between rings, just enough time for me to start doubting I'd ever heard anything. Other times it was mere seconds, beating in sync with my racing heart. I felt imprisoned in my own house, pacing from one room to another with sweat beating on my forehead and a nauseous swirl in my gut. Twice I shouted at the empty hallway to stop, my voice cracking with panic. My own words echoed back to me, muffled by the thick walls. By the time dawn arrived, I was sitting in an armchair, gripping the screwdriver in my trembling hand, feeling foolish yet unwilling to let go of that last shred of security. The next day, I decided to replace the entire setup. I drove into town and found a hardware store that sold doorbell kits. The clerk there asked if I was having trouble with my old one. I remember nodding stiffly, giving him a vague explanation about an old circuit that was malfunctioning. He made a friendly remark about how these old houses are full of surprises. I left with a new switch, new chime, and new wiring, desperately hoping to put an end to this nightmare. Installing it was a laborious process. I wanted to be sure every wire was correctly placed, every connection secure. I tested it multiple times in broad daylight, pressing the switch and hearing the crisp, pleasant chime that replaced the old grating buzz. Each successful test was a small victory. By the afternoon, I felt a fraction of my tension slip away. The memory of the previous night still clung to me, but at least I had taken action. I spent the rest of the day double-checking locks, walking the perimeter of my property, looking for signs that someone had messed with my gate or my yard. Nothing was disturbed, yet, as the sun sank behind the tree line, I felt the prickle of anxiety return. It was subtle at first, the way my chest tightened slightly, the way I jumped at the softest sound. Even the crickets outside sounded ominous, their chirping like a steady reminder that the night was alive with hidden watchers. I tried to keep busy, forcing myself to eat dinner in front of the television. Though every bite of food felt like lead in my mouth, I kept glancing at the clock, bracing for that 2 a.m. threshold. My skin crawled with anticipation, goosebumps rising on my arms in the warm night air. When midnight came and went without incident, I almost laughed at how wound up I had been. The new chime remained excellent, my gate was locked, the chain glinting under the yard light. The air was perfectly still, with only the occasional whisper of wind sliding through the pines. I began to let my guard down. I put a movie on, lowered the lights, and tried to sink into the couch. Then, a little after 1:30, I felt something, a shift in the atmosphere, the sudden flicker of a shadow across the window. It might have been a branch swaying in the breeze, but it jolted me upright, my nerves already raw. I paused the movie, my breathing ragged, my heart pounding like a drum solo in my chest. At first, the house was silent. That type of silence was overwhelming, pressing against my eardrums until I thought I could hear my own blood rushing. I stood up and flipped on the hallway light, checking the front door. Everything seemed normal. My gaze drifted to the doorbell, half expecting it to ring, and for a long moment, it didn't. I exhaled slowly, turning my back on the door, then it sounded. The ring was just as crisp and piercing as the old one, cutting through the stillness like a blade. My entire body tensed. My hands started to shake, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I froze, the hair on my arm standing on end, as if an electric current had just raced over my skin. I whipped around and ripped open the door, adrenaline giving me enough courage to confront whoever was out there. The porch was empty, just the faint glow from the light fixture in the lonely yard stretching toward the locked gate. I stepped outside, practically stomping to the steps, scanning the tree line. No movement, no hint of a figure ducking into the shadows. Yet the night air felt unnaturally cold against my flushed face, a biting chill that raised goosebumps along my spine. My fingers started to go numb in the breeze. Then, as if to mock me, the doorbell rang again. While I was standing on the porch, staring directly at the silent doorbell button. No one had touched it. Nobody stood near it. It sounded by itself. My mind reeled at the impossibility. My pulse hammered in Myers. My thoughts racing to nightmares of haunted electronics or malevolent presences attached to old houses. The rational side of me screamed about wiring errors and power surges. But none of those logical explanations could account for the unshakable feeling that something wanted my attention. The memory of that ring reverberated in my skull. Echo, I couldn't escape. I nearly tripped running back inside. I wanted to kill the power again, but a fear took hold. The last time I had done it that, the ringing continued regardless. The sensation of being watched was more intense than ever, like invisible eyes traced. My every move, my own reflection in the windows began to unnerve me, because I kept expecting to see someone else's face behind the glass. My mouth went dry and my breathing became shallow and frantic. I could feel my heart pushing against my rib cage, as though trying to escape my chest. I endured another night of that unpredictable ringing. It would go silent for a willingly to start again, just as I was beginning to calm down. Each time I jumped and clenched my fists, a surge of adrenaline spiking through me. The rest of the time, I wandered my house in an anxious haze, checking each room, switching on lights, glancing at mirrors to ensure I was truly alone. The hours dragged mercilessly, each minute stretching into an eternity of dread. My mind started to play tricks on me, conjuring faint shapes at the edges of my vision, shadows that seemed to dart away when I turned my head. I couldn't tell if it was the reflection of the television or something else, something intangible that glided through the corners of my home. When morning finally arrived, the doorbell went silent once again, as if it had never malfunctioned. Exhausted and desperate, I contacted an electrician to inspect the wiring thoroughly. He came by in the afternoon. I watched him check every connection, every circuit, and he found nothing amiss. He seemed politely puzzled, offering a few technical possibilities. Faulty ground, interference from other electronic devices. I nodded, stiffly without revealing how disturbed I was. Night came all too quickly. I sat on the couch, feeling a subtle tension coil in the pit of my stomach. Every so often, I thought I caught the outline of something near the window, but it was always just the tree branches swaying. The hours ticked by and nothing happened. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock in the morning, and I remained hyper-aware of every sound the house produced. Yet, the doorbell stayed quiet. A fragile sense of relief began to bloom in me. I even drifted off, on the couch, adrenaline finally subsiding enough to allow some rest. But then, as if choreographed by a malevolent hand, the doorbell exploded into sound. I woke with a start, almost falling off the couch, heart thundering so hard I thought it might burst. The new chime was relentless, several rings in quick succession, echoing through the house. I stood up, dizzy with panic, my head swimming as though I were underwater. My breathing turned into ragged gasps. I felt corners of my sanity fraying, the edges unraveling in the face of something that I couldn't understand or control. I considered fleeing, just driving off into the night without looking back. But a stronger urge, perhaps a twisted form of defiance, made me stay. I opened the door once more, stepping onto the porch, letting that cold wind envelop me. My fingers gripped the railing until my knuckles turned white. I could feel the tremor in my shoulders, the tension locking my jaw. A whisper of air brushed past my ears, too gentle to be a voice, but unsettling in its intimacy. In that moment, I felt certain there was something out there, standing just beyond my line of sight, toying with me as if feeding on my terror. The bell rang again, though no one pressed it. I stared at the gate in the distance, still chained, still locked, and realized I would find no answers in the darkness. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely close the door. Inside, the hallway stretched out before me like a tunnel, dimly lit by a single lamp. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, convinced one of them would move. The chime ceased abruptly, leaving me stranded in a silence that was even more terrifying. Sometimes the anticipation of the next ring was worse than the sound itself. That night, I refused to sleep. I paced until the early hours, chest tight and arms clammy. The doorbell remained dormant as dawn broke, as though the phenomenon existed only in the darkest hours. In the days that followed, I replaced the wiring again, triple-checked the installation. Nothing changed. While it doesn't happen every single night, there are times on those especially quiet evenings when it returns. The phantom ring slicing through the night like an icy blade through my spine reminds me that I'm never alone in this house. I've stopped trying to explain it rationally. I keep the gate locked. I keep the lights on. I've contemplated selling the house, but something about the property has latched onto me. I can't shake the uneasy sense that leaving would only postpone the inevitable, that the relentless ringing might follow me wherever I go. On rare occasions, I wake up drenched in sweat, certain that I heard it again. Even though it's silent, my mind is no longer my refuge. Every dream seems to circle back to that hallway, that door, that maddening chime. And when I stand on my porch in the evenings, I swear the wind carries a faint echo of a bell, as if daring me to step outside. I've made my peace with the fear, in a twisted sort of way. It lurks in my periphery, a permanent fixture of my life. Now, the ordinary comforts of home, the couch, the lamp, the warmth of the indoors, are stained with memories of those nights of relentless ringing. Even if the doorbell remains quiet for weeks, the tension never truly vanishes. It coils under my skin, waiting to strike. Sometimes I catch myself listening for it, a part of me almost expecting the bell to ring the moment my guard is down. My pulse quickens at random times during the evening, and I find myself shivering even on mild nights. I've considered the possibility that it's all in my head, a trick of stress, exhaustion, or something more deeply rooted in my psyche. But each time I think I've conjured this out of paranoia, the doorbell sounds again. Unwavering proof that there is a force beyond my understanding at work. There are no messages scrolled on my walls, no footprints in the yard, no direct confrontation, just that disembodied ring reminding me that I am never free from the unknown. It's a weight I carry. Some nights I can almost sense it like a living presence standing inches away from me. Its breath cold against my neck. I haven't told many people about this. The few who know dismiss it as faulty wiring or a bizarre electrical phenomenon. They advise me to hire specialists, tear out the entire circuit or move. Yet none of these suggestions fully address the suffocating fear that has become part of my daily life. I remain here unsure whether to keep fighting or finally surrender to the fact that my home is no longer a place of solace. Each dusk draws the possibility of its return, and each dawn leaves me wrestling with the echoes of the night. I can only hope that one day the ringing will stop, and I can reclaim some measure of peace. But every time I hear that faint chime, my dreams, I know the house is waiting, the bell always ready to sound again, reminding me that some horrors do not require a visible entity to terrorize you. They only need a broken silence and a single persistent ring. Darkness has a way of embracing everything it touches. It silences the world, makes every ordinary creak sound ominous, and warps one's sense of safety into a fragile illusion. I learned this the hard way when I moved into a house with a long overgrown backyard, an idyllic place by day, a realm of hushed dread at night. Even now, every time I replay those nocturnal encounters in my mind, my hands tremble and my breath catches in my throat. It all began so innocently, a force it left on, a slight disturbance, a strange whisper. I never anticipated the madness that would follow. I purchased the house because of my passion for gardening. The expansive backyard promised endless possibilities. During the day, sunlight poured across the lawn, highlighting the lush green grass and flower beds. Butterflies hovered over bright petals, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves of a solitary oak. Neighbors congratulated me on my new place, remarking how the previous owner had never taken advantage of the yard's potential. I was eager to prove them wrong. For the first few weeks, Everything felt perfect. I woke up at dawn, stepped out with a spade and a watering can, and worked until my shirt was soaked in sweat and my arms rusted with dirt. I fell into bed at night, exhausted, but content, lulled to sleep by the distant hum of the city. Then came that particular night. It was well past midnight, and I was in my bedroom, half asleep, when a faint metallic clink reached my ears. At first, I thought it was the pipes acting up. Old houses have a tendency to groan in protest, but the sound persisted, more rhythmic than any random plumbing noise. My pulse quickened, and I felt a dull throb at my temples. It reminded me of a tap left open, but I was certain I had shut off every faucet before heading inside. I tried to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. Stepping into the backyard was like entering a different world. Moonlight cast long, jagged shadows across the grass. The air felt colder than usual, with an unsettling stillness that prickled at the back of my neck. My breath came in shallow spurts, and a wave of goosebumps rippled along my arms. I noticed the faucet near the hedge trickling water, droplets catching the moonlight as they fell onto the cracked pavement. I swallowed hard, more annoyed than afraid, and moved to turn it off. That was when I felt something behind me, an intangible mass in the air, as though the darkness had somehow become sentient. My heart pounded with such force that I thought my chest might burst. My left ear burned with sudden warmth, and an almost imperceptible bass whispered my name. The sound was so close, so intimate, that I instinctively jerked away. I spun around, nearly losing my balance on the damp ground. There was no one behind me. The gate at the end of the yard was locked, its rusted chains swaying gently. My eyes darted across the darkness, but I saw only silhouettes of bushes in the crooked fence. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and I wiped it away with trembling fingers. I wanted to call out to demand an explanation, but my throat felt some paper dry. I backed away from the faucet, my pulse roaring in my ears. The urge to flee overwhelmed me. With hasty steps, I returned to the house, double-checking that I had locked the door behind me. The rest of the night was a blur of restlessness. I lay in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, ears straining for any hint of that voice again. By dawn, I had almost convinced myself it had been a half-dream, a trick played by exhaustion. For several days afterward, I avoided going into the backyard at night. The daily routine of gardening continued as usual, but a subtle dread settled in my gut. During the afternoons, I caught myself scanning the edges of the property, looking for footprints or any sign of an intruder, yet there was nothing. Everything appeared perfectly mundane, which only made the memory more disturbing. I found myself plagued by questions. Had I truly heard my name whispered, or was it some phantom echo in my head? A week later, I had to retrieve a toolbox from the laundry area attached to the back of the house. It was late, maybe around 11 o'clock, but not quite the dead of night. I told myself there was no reason to be afraid. The interior light in the laundry room was bright enough, and I assured myself that I was being paranoid. Still, as I stepped out into the cool air, I felt that same prickling unease spread across my skin. The short walk to the laundry door seemed to stretch longer than usual, and each footstep felt loud in my ears. I reached the door and flipped on the overhead bulb, blinking at the sudden light. The washing machine stood in thickener, silent and unthreatening, and the shelves held bottles of detergent and spare racks. Everything was normal, but just as I exhaled and began to search for my toolbox, I heard it again. A whisper so faint it might have been a breath. It was my name, repeated, like a secret only the darkness knew. My heart lurched and I felt a rush of ice-cold terror coil around my spine. Even though the voice was quiet, it resonated inside my head, haunting and persistent. I spun around, nearly knocking over a bucket in my haste. No one was there. That moment sent me spiraling into a new realm of anxiety. I spent the following days in a haze of fear and self-doubt. I told a friend about it without revealing every creepy detail. and he brushed it off, suggesting the wind could distort sounds, or perhaps I was under too much stress from the recent move. He reassured me that any whisper I heard was most likely a product of my imagination. I tried to believe him, but my body's reaction said otherwise. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a crushing weight on my chest. My palms would sweat, and a nauseous dread filled my stomach at the thought of stepping outside. I became obsessed with mundane noises, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the living room wall. If a branch scraped the window, my heart would surge, and I'd jump up expecting some presence lurking just beyond the pane of glass. My home, once a source of pride and comfort, felt more like a labyrinth of foreboding shadows. Even the corridor leading to the kitchen seemed longer at night, the overhead bulbs casting elongated shapes on the floor, shapes that sometimes appeared to move when my eyes were half closed. The backyard itself grew increasingly ominous. During the day, I forced myself to tend to the plants, pulling weeds, watering rose bushes, trimming dead branches. Yet I did it all on edge, constantly peering over my shoulder. A few times I swore I glimpsed something out of the corner of my eye, a dark silhouette standing by the fence, or a faint movement in the thick shrubbery. But whenever I turned my head, there was nothing but leaves stirring in the breeze. My heart would hammer so fiercely that I needed to pause, rubbing at my temples, in an effort to ground myself. By the second week, my sleep was in ruins. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I had heard footsteps crunching the gravel outside. I'd hold my breath and listen, every muscle tense, the hair on my arms bristling. Sometimes I would muster the courage to peek through the curtains. The yard looked peaceful beneath the moonlight, save for the occasional rustle of leaves, yet I couldn't escape the conviction that something was out there watching. As my paranoia escalated, the boundaries between dream and reality blurred. One night, I jolted upright, certain I had heard my name called from inside the house. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, revealing the pitch-black corridor. A chill bled through my bones, and my teeth chattered with a primal panic. It took slow steps to the door, each footstep landing like a small earthquake in my mind, and flicked on the hallway light. The corridor was empty. Nevertheless, I felt suffocated by the notion that something unseen was following me, trailing my every movement like a patient predator. In a desperate attempt to regain control, I set up outdoor floodlights. I installed one near the faucet and another by the gate, hoping that banishing the darkness would also banish my fear. I kept them on through the night, their harsh beams illuminating every inch of the backyard, yet it offered me no true relief. In fact, the bright light created stark, looming shadows that stretched across the lawn in unnatural shapes. It was as if I had turned my backyard into a stage, inviting something hidden to step into the glow. I tried ignoring it all. I tried to focus on daily activities, inviting friends over, so the house wouldn't feel so empty. Yet, I never spoke in detail about the whispers. Instead, I felt the tension build inside, a private dread that no one else seemed to notice. When I was alone, the atmosphere grew thick and oppressive, as though the walls themselves were leaning in, pressing me down. My breaths became shallow, my palms clammy, and my vision sometimes flickered at the edges. A particularly harrowing episode occurred late one evening as I attempted to gather some garden tools I had forgotten outside. The motion sensor lights clicked on, flooding the yard with artificial brightness. My gaze locked onto the hedge where I had first heard whisper. A tremor shot through my legs, making them feel weak and unsteady. I inched forward, telling myself there would be nothing there. Suddenly, the sensor light flickered, dimming, for a split second. In that brief moment of semi-darkness, I caught the shape of something sliding behind a tree. A fleeting outline that sent a jolt of pure terror through every nerve in my body. When the light snapped back to full power, there was no one. I rushed back inside, heart racing, sweat pouring down my face. My hands refused to stop shaking for a long time afterward, and sleep didn't come until the early hours of the morning. I started questioning my own sanity. I tried to recall the events objectively, the voice whispering my name, the glimpses of movement, the oppressive feeling of being watched. Were these experiences external manifestations of something, some spirit or entity, or maybe an actual intruder who enjoyed taunting me? Or were they internal, the byproducts of an overworked mind and an overactive imagination? My nights became a battleground between rational thought and a primal sense of dread. Eventually, I decided I had to confront it, or at least prove to myself there was nothing to fear. One night, under a waning crescent moon, I armed myself with a flashlight and walked out the back door. My heart thudded like a war drum, and my breath came in ragged, uneven bursts. Each step felt like I was pushing against invisible resistance, an air pressure that thickened around me, stifling my lungs. The yard was silent, except for the soft buzz of a nearby street lamp. I shone the flashlight across every corner, the hedge, the fence, the faucet, the solitary oak. Nothing, no shape, no movement, no intruder. Yet, I couldn't shake the certainty of a presence. My arm trembled so badly that the flashlight beam shook erratically across the grass. As I neared the corner of the yard, I sensed something to my left, and without warning, that same whisper slithered into my ear. It was so close that I felt a breath of cold air brush my skin. My name drawn out like a desperate plea or a twisted invitation. My throat seized. I gasped, unable to form any words. I spun the flashlight toward the spot, but the light fell only on empty space. My chest was tight, each heartbeat a painful throb in my ribs. I realized I was muttering to myself under my breath, begging whatever it was to leave me alone. There was no answer, just the stale hush of the night. I don't remember returning to the house. My mind blanks from that moment until I found myself slumped on the living room floor, the flashlight still clenched in my damp fist. I sat there, heart throbbing, knees weak, trying to slow my erratic breathing. Adrenaline hammered through my veins, and my ears buzzed as though I'd been standing too close to a siren. A nauseating swirl of fear, confusion, and exhaustion made the room spin. That was the moment I understood something fundamental. What haunted me might not be a person or a common ghostly apparition. It could be the very fabric of the place, an echo from some forgotten event, or a manifestation of energies I couldn't comprehend. Or maybe it was a reflection of my own dread, a psychological vortex pulling me deeper every night. I realized I might never find a concrete answer, but one thing was certain: my backyard, my once peaceful haven, had become a zone of inexplicable terror. In the following days, I made plans to leave. I arranged for the house to be put on the market, ignoring the pang of regret over the garden I'd worked so hard to cultivate. I felt a wave of guilt about potentially passing the strange atmosphere onto someone else. But I convinced myself that it might just be me, my own mind unraveling. If someone else moved in and never encountered anything unusual, then perhaps I truly had lost my grip on reality. Yet, if they did experience the same phenomenon, maybe they'd be braver or more knowledgeable, capable of dealing with it in a way I wasn't. On my last night in the house, I sat in the living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes, determined to stay awake until sunrise. The lamp cast a feeble yellow glow that danced eerily across the walls. My skin felt clammy. I could smell the faint tang of my own sweat. My mouth was dry, and every time the house settled or a branch tapped the window, I jolted upright, heart racing, but nothing whispered my name. No presence closed in around me. The silence itself became suffocating, like a quiet threat lingering just out of reach. When morning came, I felt both relieved and somewhat resentful. It was as if the house had chosen not to show its dark side that final night, leaving me uncertain whether I was escaping a real threat or running from a figment of my imagination. Yet the sense of unease clung to me. Even now in a new place, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, straining to hear the faint echo of my name on the wind. My pulse quickens and I recall that yard, that faucet dripping under the moonlight, and the piercing dread of knowing something unseen called out to me. I've never returned to see what became of the house. Perhaps the new owner lives happily, unaware of any secret presence lurking behind the hedges. Or perhaps the darkness still lingers, biding its time, waiting for a moment of weakness to slip back into a whisper at someone's ear. Either way, the memory remains lodged in me. A constant reminder that some silences are more terrifying than screams, and some corners of our world defy simple explanation. I can only hope that whatever hid in that yard was content to let me leave, and an easy truce formed between my fear and the shadows that breathed my name. The air felt wrong the moment I laid eyes on that house. There was something about its immaculate exterior, freshly painted walls, and gleaming windows that struck me as both inviting and repulsive. The sight of a place so pristine yet undeniably abandoned sent a cold ripple down my spine, as though a silent warning tried to hold me back. Even now, my stomach clenches at the memory of stepping across that threshold, where the darkness inside felt conscious and watchful, far more than any normal house should. I had heard rumors about the place before. Some people claimed they saw faint lights passing behind the curtains at night, even though no one ever turned on a switch. Others whispered about engine-like growls echoing around the property, as if a vehicle idled just out of sight. Curiosity can be a peculiar force, and it led me, along with two friends, to test the limits of our own caution. The decision to explore the house on that particular Friday night was spontaneous, almost flippant, as though we had no real sense of the danger we were courting. We approached from the end of the street, strolling in the moonlit shadows to avoid drawing attention. The house loomed at the cul-de-sac like a silent guardian, its white paint reflecting the moonlight in an eerie glow. My friends walked on either side of me, Julian on my left and Matt on my right, but we scarcely spoke. It felt as though the house itself demanded silence. The front door seemed an unwise point of entry. It faced the road, wide open for any passerby to notice. So, we circled around to the backyard, where we found a slightly crooked wooden gate. Pushing it open revealed a neglected garden complete with patches of dead grass and thorny vines that never quite touched the house's pristine walls. It was odd how the vegetation around the structure appeared stunted and hostile in direct contrast to the carefully maintained facade. We managed to open the back door without too much trouble. The lock, either old or rarely used, gave way with a ragged metallic click that set every nerve in my body on edge. Once inside, I realized the entire house smelled of musty furniture, Polish, as though someone had cleaned recently, but left it all to stagnate in darkness. The place was definitely furnished. Couches, tables, chairs, all neatly arranged, but there was no sign of actual living. Every piece of wood gleamed under the pale glow of our flashlights, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the chill of being someplace I was never meant to enter. We whispered among ourselves to keep our bearings. I recall Julian remarking in hushed tones that something about the living room too untouched, like a showroom preserved in time. I agreed with him, but kept my voice low, although we tried not to say much. I couldn't shake the feeling that our mere presence violated a silent, oppressive rule. My pulse throbbed in my neck, each heartbeat drumming a deeper sense of foreboding, and we advanced further into the house. The corridors were surprisingly narrow. Our flashlights illuminated unlit sections of wall and floor immediately around us, and the shadows beyond flickered and swayed, occasionally suggesting movement where none should exist. At one point, I thought I caught a glimpse of a shifting shape against the far end of the hallway, like a figure turning a corner. I froze, flashlight beam trembling in my hand. When I strained my eyes to see beyond the darkness, there was nothing. My heart pounded so violently that I worried it might echo against the silent walls. We passed what looked like a sitting room, filled with shelves of weathered books, each volume appearing untouched by time or dust. By the faint glow of the flashlight, I saw a grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum still. It felt bizarre to stand there among so many signs of supposed occupation, yet be enveloped by total stillness. Somewhere behind me, I felt Julian's breath hitch. Matt kept taking short, tense breaths that sounded almost like quiet whimpers in the hush of that place. The tension was excruciating. I forced myself to remain calm, but my skin was clammy beneath my jacket, and my mouth had gone utterly dry. Progressing through the house, we avoided speaking to maintain some semblance of composure. Occasionally, we gesture or tap each other's shoulders to point out something strange. A door slightly ajar leading into blackness. A painting with an image too faded to discern, but with a suspicious outline that made me uneasy, or the subtle imprint on the carpet, as if someone had paced back and forth. Each discovery tightened the coil of fear in my stomach. I felt my throat constrict every time I breathed in that stale air. Then, out of nowhere, a distant rumble reverberated around the house. It sounded exactly like an engine moving at a low register, rising and falling in waves, as though someone was repeatedly pressing a pedal. All three of us tensed, flashlights darting to the nearest windows. The noise rumbled, paused, and rumbled again. I'm not sure if it was real or if my nerves were playing tricks on my ears, but it grew in volume until it seemed to pass just outside the walls. We hurried to a window in a nearby room, perhaps a dining area, judging by the large table cloaked in dust covers, and peered outside. The moonlit backyard was lifeless, the fence bordering a murky alley, no headlights, no vehicle, nothing that would explain the deep mechanical growl, yet it persisted, vibrating through the very foundation beneath our feet. Adrenaline surged in my veins. I could feel my lungs tighten with each breath. Julian motioned for us to keep moving, perhaps to find the source. Matt seemed more hesitant, his posture betraying that he wanted to retreat. I was caught in the middle, torn between the urge to flee and the compulsion to uncover the truth behind this bizarre phenomenon. We crept through another corridor. The deeper we got, the more I became conscious of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped and the air felt heavy against my skin, as if saturated with intangible static. My neck prickled as though dozens of unseen eyes followed our every move. In my peripheral vision, I kept noticing glimmers, faint flickers, of motion that vanished the instant I turned my head. Perspiration gathered on my forehead, trickling down the sides of my face. Despite the cold, my heart's pounding had become a physical force in my chest. Our flashlight beams danced across another hallway, scanning door after door until we reached one that seemed locked or jammed. We tried the knob. It wouldn't budge. Just as Julian leaned forward to apply more force, I heard footsteps in the yard. At first, I thought they might be echoes of our own, but the pattern of steps was different, louder, more deliberate, and clearly outside the house. The footsteps advanced across the lawn and circled near the windows, methodically tracing a path around the perimeter. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed against a wall, switching off my flashlight in a frantic motion. Julian and Matt followed suit, plunging us into near-complete darkness. Our only illumination came from the faint moonlight spilling through cracks in the blinds. We stood paralyzed as we listened to that slow, rhythmic stomp. The footsteps were not frantic or rushed. They were steady, calculated, and unnervingly close. I recall a horrible sensation of exposure in that moment, as though whoever was pacing outside could see right through the walls to where we huddled. My muscles tensed and sweat beaded on my scalp. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and my mouth felt as though it had been packed with cotton. When I summoned the Corrugette to peer out through a tiny gap in the curtains, I saw nothing. The backyard remained still, the fence line dark and unoccupied. Yet the sounds of boots trudging over the grass persisted. It was as if the house itself conjured the noise to torture us. Minutes passed, each second and eternity. Eventually, the footsteps ceased, replaced once more by that low engine growl, now distant as if receding down the street. Yet still, no vehicle ever materialized. We exchanged terrified glances in the darkness, each of us reflecting the other's disbelief. I could feel the tremor in my hands when I relit my flashlight and gestured for us to continue toward the rear exit. As we made our way back, that sense of being watched intensified. The corridor leading to the back door seemed longer than before, as though the house had shifted its internal layout to keep us trapped. Every reflection in the polished wood felt like an eye turned in our direction, a silent witness to our mounting panic. My throat felt so tight that swallowing became an ordeal. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I kept fighting the urge to break into a sprint. Passing the living room again, I couldn't resist taking a quick glance around. The furniture, though beautiful, felt oppressive in its perfection. The couch cushions appeared recently fluffed, and a small side table bore an ornate lamp. There was even a vase of dried flowers in the corner, their petals curiously intact. It all hinted at constant upkeep, yet no caretaker was anywhere to be found. My rational mind kept insisting that nobody had lived here for years, but my senses screamed otherwise. I felt physically ill, as though this pristine environment defied any explanation I could accept. We pushed onward, forcing ourselves to hurry despite the knot of dread in our stomachs. My legs were stiff from tension, and every nerve in my body yearned for escape. When we reached the back door, we found it slightly ajar. I knew we had closed it behind us when we entered. Each of us silently questioned whether someone or something had opened it from the outside. My heart hammered so hard, I felt the pulse echo up into my temples. The bitter taste of adrenaline coated my tongue, and I realized I was trembling all over. Without uttering more than a half-chid whisper, we stepped onto the porch. The yard looked unremarkable: patchy grass, the looming fence, and a single stone path leading to the gate. The engine rumble had faded into a memory, but the tension lingered like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I glanced around, expecting to see movement in every dark corner. The heavy silence was somehow worse than the noise, for it left too much room for my imagination to conjure threats lurking just out of sight. We hurried across the yard with quiet steps, our flashlights turned off to avoid drawing attention. My breathing was shallow and erratic, and I could sense that Julian and Matt felt the same. My palms were slipped with sweat, and my mind kept darting back to those phantom footsteps, circling the house. Still, no figure emerged to stop us. No mysterious vehicle materialized at the end of the driveway. We reached the wooden gate, yanked it open, and stumbled out into the deserted street. Standing there under the pale glow of the street lamp, I felt a wave of relief, so acute it nearly buckled my knees. Yet that relief was tainted by unresolved terror. I felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath me might vanish at any second. The other houses on the street were dark and lifeless, providing no sense of refuge. For a few moments, none of us spoke. We simply looked back at the pristine structure we had just fled, waiting for something else to happen. A face to appear in the window, or the door to slam shut on its own. Instead, the house remained still, an immaculate shell concealing unspeakable tension. We left in a hurried silence, each of us nursing our own private fear. The rational side of my mind insisted it had all been a series of coincidences and illusions. Perhaps the echo of some distant generator or a car engine had reverberated oddly in that narrow cul-de-sac. Maybe the footsteps were our own, distorted by the house's acoustics. But part of me knew better. Even in my attempts to rationalize, I couldn't shake the sense that something in that house had watched us, followed us, and let us go only because it wanted to. I could almost feel the gaze burning into my back as we moved further away from the property. Later that night, I could barely sleep. Every noise in my home made me flinch. Pipes settling, whined against the window, the hum of their refrigerator. My mind transformed every sound into a ghostly echo of that terrifying throbbing engine, or those predatory footsteps scraping the grass. My heart pounded at intervals, and cold sweat gathered on my brow in the darkness. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the house's furnished rooms, lit by the narrow beams of our flashlights. I'd wake up with my chest tight, convinced something stood in the corner of my bedroom, watching. But of course, there was nothing there except empty shadows. The days that followed offered no clarity. I returned to that street once in daylight, only from a distance, hoping to dispel the dread with sunlight and rational observation. The house looked just as before, impeccably maintained, white paint unblemished. The gate in the backyard was closed, and the windows revealed no sign of life. I felt a shiver run through me as I stared from the relative safety of my parked car, wondering if I imagined at all. Yet, the memory of that engine's roar, the precise cadence of footsteps along the perimeter, and the unsettling cleanliness of the interior told me otherwise. There was something in that place, something beyond my grasp and beyond logic. Even now, I have no solid explanation for what we encountered. Sometimes I suspect there is more to that house, perhaps something that clings to it. A presence that keeps it unnaturally clean and preserved, lurking to confound anyone foolhardy enough to enter. Other times, I consider the possibility that we were caught in our own collective paranoia, that our minds twisted every creak and echo into a supernatural threat. But that explanation never gives me comfort. It only makes me doubt my own senses and question my grip on reality. The memory of those footsteps methodically circling the windows remains the single most haunting aspect. They were to measured, to knowing. There was an unmistakable sense of intelligence behind that pacing, an intent to observe and provoke. I often wonder if we were the first to experience it. Somehow I doubt it. Places like that don't stay hidden forever. They attract the curious, the thrill-seekers, the brave, and the naive. I find myself torn between warning others to stay away and accepting that some won't believe until they experience it themselves. I don't plan to go back. That house, and whatever lurks within its walls, can keep their secrets. I value my sanity too much to risk another confrontation, and yet, part of me remains caught in its snare, replaying the night's events, marveling at how quickly I found myself at the mercy of an indescribable presence. I suppose that's the true horror. It never really leaves you. It takes root in your mind, in your nightmares, in every strange sound you hear when you're alone. You can run out of that house, but you can't run from the fear it imprints on you. That's the final impression I'm left with. A house too perfect to be empty, and a darkness within it too intangible to be explained. Perhaps no one will ever truly unravel the secrets of that place. If there is a hidden occupant, it seems content to remain unseen, waiting for the next visitor to step inside and discover what shouldn't be there. My only advice, born of raw experience, is simple. If you see a place that's too clean, too polished, and somehow still abandoned, think twice before going in. Some doors once opened lead to questions you may never answer. The memory of that night has lodged itself in my soul, a constant, unsettling reminder that sometimes the scariest things in life are the ones we can't see, but still manage to hear, breathing just beyond the walls and pacing in the darkness where our flashlights fail to reach door. Sometimes in the deepest reaches of night, I swear the silence twists into something far more sinister than a mere lack of sound. It presses in around the walls of my house, thick and suffocating, like a living organism. And in that heaviness, I often feel as if I'm not alone. My heart constricts, my breath hitches, and there's a crawling sensation on my skin that refuses to dissipate. That's how it started. An unsettling awareness that from my terrace, I wasn't the only thing peering into that patch of preserved woods. Every time I looked, I sensed something looking back. I moved into this property primarily because I loved how close it was to nature. At first, the view of the towering trees seemed a refuge from the clamour of a more crowded city life. The canopy remained a vivid green during the day, and at dusk, the leaves transformed into a dark, rustling tapestry. It was on one of those dim evenings when I caught sight of a figure slipping between the tree trunks. It was so fleeting that I questioned whether I'd truly seen anything at all. Yet something about its silhouette struck me as off, too tall perhaps and disturbingly thin. My pulse spiked and my mouth went dry, but I convinced myself it was merely the shape of overlapping branches or a deer wandering close to the edge of the forest. I tried to rationalize it. For several days, I didn't see anything else, and I almost managed to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then came the night I saw movement again. This time I was leaning against the terrace railing, enjoying the cool breeze when I detected a faint rustling below. My eyes combed the darkness, half expectant, half dreading. That's when I spotted it like a smudge against the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. It was tall, yes, and it moved with a languid slowness that was deeply unsettling. It stopped at one point, turning what I assumed was its head in my direction. My chest tightened, and I felt an odd tug in my stomach, as though gravity itself had intensified. I swallowed hard, trying to wet my tongue against my teeth. A cold sweat broke out along my back. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept by the patio door, thumbed the switch, and aimed the beam straight into the darkness. Nothing, only tree trunks and swaying branches. My heart thundered so loudly in my ears that it drowned out the faint chirp of night insects. I turned off the flashlight and stood there for several minutes just listening, but the woods offered no answers. The next morning, a jittery sense of unease lingered. I tried to focus on my regular routine, shower, coffee, scanning messages on my phone, but every time I glanced toward the window, my mind conjured that shadowy figure. My stomach fluttered with anxiety, and I felt a clammy dampness in my palms. Eventually, I decided to walk down to the edge of the forest. The sun was bright and the air smelled earthy, almost comforting. If there was any place I'd find clues, it would be at the spot where I had seen those unnerving movements. My ears rang with my own heartbeat as I stepped onto the soft soil. I parted low-hanging branches, scanning the ground for footprints or any other sign that someone or something had passed through. All I found were a few leaves scattered in unusual patterns, as though they'd been kicked aside. There was no obvious path, no broken twigs that would confirm a presence. Yet, the stifling feeling of being watched grew stronger the longer I stayed there. A strange heaviness seized my chest, as though the forest itself disapproved of my intrusion. I retreated, trying not to break into a run. Each snap of a twig beneath my feet made me flinch. By the time I got back home, my clothes stuck to my body with sweat, and my mind buzzed with dread. That night, I found myself pacing around the living room, not wanting to look outside, but unable to resist the compulsion. Eventually, I returned to the terrace, heart pounding. The darkness seemed denser than usual, an almost tangible cloak that extended from the woods up to the sky. I raised the flashlight again, shining it among the trunks. For a few seconds, everything appeared normal. Then I detected a slight shift in the shadows, like a ripple in the dark. As quickly as I sensed it, it vanished. My entire body trembled. It felt like the ground beneath me was swaying, though I knew it was just my adrenaline surging. A voice inside my head insisted I must be hallucinating, that fear and lack of sleep were messing with my perception, that deep down I couldn't shake the certainty that there was something else out there, something that did not belong in the realm of the ordinary. I tried to confide in a friend over the phone, explaining that I kept seeing shapes in the woods. They suggested it might be stress, pointing out that I'd moved recently and might not be used to the isolation. I listened to their advice. Maybe I needed some rest, maybe a weekend away. However, their words felt hollow, as if they applied only to common worries and didn't account for the creeping terror I was experiencing. In the back of my mind, a stubborn voice whispered that I wasn't imagining things, that something real and malevolent stood among those trees, watching me with quiet intent. That notion clung to me, refusing to let go. I began avoiding the terrace at night, but that didn't help. Instead, my nights were plagued by the sensation that something was near. The worst part was that I couldn't pin down the exact nature of the threat. Was it a person, an animal, or was my mind playing tricks? Anxiety nodded at me like a relentless parasite. I started catching glimpses of shadows inside my home, drifting near windows or across the hallway. My heart hammered each time I rounded a corner, half expecting to come face to face with that figure I'd seen outside. My breath grew ragged at the slightest sound. The creak of a floorboard felt like a thunderclap inside my skull. My palms constantly itched with sweat, and my face felt feverishly hot. In my own reflections, I noticed a subtle transformation. My eyes were ringed with dark circles, and my expression looked haunted. One particularly suffocating night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed, listening to the faint rustle of leaves outside my window, wondering if it was just the wind. The stillness was abruptly broken by a soft scraping noise coming from downstairs, like fingernails dragging along the outer walls. My lungs constricted as though a vice had locked around them. For a moment, I struggled to draw a full breath. Summoning courage, I crept down the steps, each footfall causing the wooden boards to groan. My pulse thundered in my chest, and I pressed my ear against the front door, straining to hear even the faintest shuffle. It was silent on the other side, so I switched on the porch light, half expecting to see a silhouette lurking there. Nothing, just an empty porch and the darkness beyond. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something had been there only seconds earlier. I felt as if the night itself held its breath, waiting for me to open the door and step outside. In the days that followed, my paranoia grew uncontrollable. I refused to entertain guests, feeling too unsettled to explain my state of mind. I kept my curtains drawn, both during the day and the night. The forest that had once been a source of natural beauty now loomed in my nightmares, an ominous presence that refused to stay confined within the boundaries of my imagination. I started hearing subtle noises in the walls, gentle tapping as if slender fingers probed the wood. My skin prickled with a constant sense of foreboding. Even in the middle of the afternoon, I'd catch my reflection and swear I saw something move behind me, though when I turned, there was only empty space. Eventually, the tension became too much to bear. I decided I had to confront whatever was happening, no matter the risk. On a mist-shrouded evening, I ventured into the backyard with a powerful flashlight and a desperate determination. My breathing was shallow, heart rattling in my ribcage, hands numb from gripping the flashlight so tightly. The air felt thicker than usual, almost too heavy to inhale. As I stepped closer to the tree line, the soft glow of the porch light behind me began to fade. Shadows lengthened, and the shapes of the forest seemed to shift with each step I took. I scanned the area, the beam of my flashlight cutting across trunks and tangled undergrowth. My fingers trembled on the switch, but I pressed on, ignoring the frantic pounding in my ears. Then, at the edge of my vision, I spotted movement. I swung the flashlight beam toward it. For a fraction of a second, I could have sworn I saw that tall, slender figure, its form almost merging with the bark of a tree. It was as if it were made from the very darkness that enveloped the woods. My throat constricted, and I had to force myself to swallow. My muscles felt rigid. Just as soon as the shape appeared, it vanished again, dissolving into the gloom. I heard a faint rustling to my left and whipped my flashlight in that direction, but I saw only fluttering leaves. I tried to calm myself with slow breaths, but each inhalation felt like a blade, slicing my lungs from the inside. At some point, I realized I'd wandered deeper into the woods than intended. My house was just a faint glow in the distance. The sheer weight of the trees pressed down on me, the canopy overhead reducing what little moonlight there was to a thin, pale glimmer. I felt an irrational terror that I might never find my way back, as though the forest had swallowed my surroundings, rearranged them to trap me. My legs shook with exhaustion and dread. The hair on the back of my neck stood up when I perceived a muffled whisper. It was unintelligible, like a breeze weaving through the branches, but it carried a tone that felt almost alive. Desperate to leave, I turned and started walking back. Twigs snapped underfoot, each one making me flinch. My flashlight flickered, which made a surge of panic tighten my chest even more. In that split second, I could have sworn I saw a human-like silhouette leaning forward, head cocked at an odd angle, studying me. My stomach churned and fresh sweat trickled down my spine. Then the silhouette receded like a spectre, and the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Overwhelmed, I staggered into the house, locked the door, bolted it, and collapsed onto the couch. My limbs felt like lead, yet my heart still beat erratically, and my thoughts whirled. Still see that flicker of light in the corner of my mind, the half-G glimpse shapes in the corners of my vision, and wonder if some doors, once opened, are not so easily closed. The worst part is not knowing whether it was truly something paranormal, or if it was a darkness within me, awakened by that building's silent halls and flickering bulbs. Either way, the memory leaves me forever on edge, listening for the faintest hum, watching for the slightest shift in shadow, and waiting for the next time my own eyes deceive me.